Hey friends, tonight we turn our attention to a time so ancient that it stretches beyond the memory of empires, into the dusty streets and dimly lit courtyards of the world's first great cities. We're going back to Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, where clay tablets recorded debts, prayers and punishments, and where even the most ordinary lives were weighed down by laws and customs that have long since crumbled into silence. If you find yourself drifting into these quiet corners of history with me, consider subscribing. It helps keep the stories flowing, and it means you'll always have another slow journey through the past waiting for you when the night grows long. And if the calm of this history finds you well, a quiet like on the video or a note in the comments about where you're listening from helps this little community grow, one slow evening at a time. In the beginning of recorded human memory, there stretched a land suspended between two rivers, where the slow, patient waters of the Tigris and the Euphrates carved their way through silt and clay. It was here that human beings began to build cities in earnest. Not just settlements of mud and reed, but enclosed worlds of stone, temple and law. Mesopotamia, the land between rivers, became a basin where generations layered their lives like the clay tablets they pressed with styluses, leaving impressions of their deeds and debts behind for millennia to read. The region became a mosaic of city-states, Uruk, Eridu, Lagash, each one rising like an island above the floodplain, each one tied together by canals, walls, and the shared fragility of human ambition. The rhythm of these early cities was not the sharp beat of conquest, though there were many wars, but rather the soft pulse of repetition. Dawn broke, smoke rose from hearths, and people left their small sun-dried houses to work in fields, to craft pottery, to grind grain, to tend goats, to sell fish, to draw water from wells. The streets were narrow, their packed earth darkened by the passing of many bare feet. The soundscape was not filled with music, but with the thud of wooden carts, the braying of donkeys, the sharp voices of merchants calling prices in marketplaces shaded by woven reed mats. The air carried the smell of barley beer, of fish drying in the sun, of the riverbanks themselves, sour and fertile. At the center of these early urban landscapes stood the ziggurat. Its terraced steps rose above the low rooftops, a stairway for the gods to descend. Priests and temple administrators ruled these sanctuaries as carefully as kings ruled their palaces. They organized offerings, sacrifices and festivals, but also the ledgers of grain and wool, the records of land, the obligations of tenants. The temple was both spiritual and administrative, a place where incense mingled with the dust of stored goods. Religion was not separate from daily existence. It was woven into contracts, prices and punishments. As cities expanded, so did the need for regulation. The earliest laws carved into stone or pressed into clay established the shape of urban life. They named theft, debt, marriage and property as matters to be overseen, managed and judged. Behind every rule was a story of a dispute, two farmers quarreling over irrigation water, two families contesting an inheritance, a trader demanding repayment. Law was a scaffold that allowed these cities to hold together in the crowded press of humanity. But within these regulations, not all lives were framed equally. Some people stood within the protection of household and kinship, while others found themselves outside its bounds, pressed into the margins. It was in these early cities that professions began to diversify. No longer was survival tied exclusively to farming or herding. The presence of surplus meant specialization. Scribes who spent their days etching symbols, merchants who bartered with lands beyond the horizon, builders who mixed bitumen and brick, brewers who fermented barley into the intoxicating drink of the people. And alongside them, other professions emerged, those whose work was born of human desire, human need, and human vulnerability. Some became entertainers, musicians with harps or drums. Some became healers, compounding herbs in clay bowls, and some became women who sold their bodies for coin, grain, or beer. The rise of prostitution in Mesopotamia was not abrupt but gradual, woven into the fabric of urbanization itself. In small villages, kinship networks shielded women from being left utterly alone. In cities, however, population density created both opportunity and anonymity. Strangers brushed past each other, in streets where family ties meant less. Poverty was sharper, widows more common, slaves more numerous, debts more pressing. To live outside the security of a household in Mesopotamia was to exist precariously, and many women found that their survival rested upon transactions that carried both economic necessity and social condemnation. Daily life in the city was relentless, and the division between respectable and marginal labor was visible to all. Respectable women were cloaked in veils, symbols of their belonging to a household and a man's authority. Those without such belonging, those who worked in taverns, those who offered sex in exchange for food, those who drifted at the edges of temple or marketplace, were marked by the absence of this protection. The city thrived upon its contrasts, its capacity to sustain both kings in palaces and beggars in streets, both temple priestesses in embroidered garments and prostitutes waiting outside taverns with loose hair. The weight of stigma was slow to crystallize, but it hardened over centuries. Early on, prostitution was tied in ambiguous ways to the temple. Some women were dedicated to gods, their sexuality framed as sacred, their labor belonging not to themselves but to divine service. Over time, however, most sex workers were neither holy nor honored. Instead, they became the shadowed figures of the city, recognized in law, recorded in punishment, but rarely celebrated in life. Yet, paradoxically, their existence was a constant. Every city had them, every generation knew of them, and every legal code addressed them. Evenings in Mesopotamia carried a hush, but the cities did not sleep. Oil lamps flickered in homes, casting small circles of light. Courtyards cooled under the stars, and the streets, though quieter, still bore figures moving between taverns and markets. Prostitutes worked here, at the edges of visibility, their presence both sought and despised. Their lives, tied to the structures of law and the demands of survival, reveal as much about Mesopotamian society as the temples and palaces do. It was in these earliest cities that the foundations of their suffering were laid: the harsh codes, the dependence on male guardianship, the economic fragility of women outside kinship networks. To understand why it truly sucked to be a prostitute in Mesopotamia, one must first understand what it meant to be a woman there at all. For gender shaped every law, every custom, every expectation pressed into clay. To speak of women in Mesopotamia is to enter the rhythms of daily existence, the slow turn of domestic labor, and the quiet persistence of responsibilities that stretched across centuries without much change. From the early city-states of Sumer to the later dominance of Babylon and Assyria, women were woven into the social fabric as keepers of households, as mothers of children, and as workers of tasks that sustained families in the small but essential details of life. Their labor rarely reached the clay tablets of scribes, unless it was tied to contracts, dowries, or punishments, yet their presence filled the narrow rooms of homes, the open courtyards of dwellings, and the shaded corners of markets. The Mesopotamian household was a world of its own. Small in size, yet complex in expectation. Women rose at dawn with the rest of the city, kindling fires, grinding grain, fetching water. Flour dust and the rhythm of the grinding stone marked many mornings. The sound as steady as the footsteps outside in the lanes. Bread and beer were staples, and women were central to their preparation. Brewing barley beer, a thick, nutritious liquid, was a task that demanded both time and knowledge, and many women became skilled brewers, producing the drink consumed daily by all classes. Beer was not a luxury but a necessity, safer than river water, and its production placed women's labor at the heart of survival. Weaving, too, was a defining activity. Looms of wood and string hung in courtyards where women sat for long hours, turning wool into cloth. The products of this work clothed families and entered markets as trade goods. Mesopotamian records speak of large workshops tied to temples where groups of women worked collectively, producing textiles in quantity. While these positions gave women a form of economic role, they were still overseen by male administrators and tied to institutions larger than themselves. Autonomy was limited. Their skill belonged to household or temple, not to their own free choosing. Marriage structured women's lives more than any single occupation. A woman's status was almost always framed through her relation to a man: daughter, wife, widow. Marriage contracts, recorded carefully in cuneiform, spelled out dowries, property rights, and expectations of fidelity. Wives were bound by strict codes. Their behavior was subject to scrutiny, their roles clearly defined. respectable women were veiled in public, a mark not of oppression in the modern sense but of distinction, signaling that they belonged to households and were under male protection. This veil separated them from slaves, servants and prostitutes, who were forbidden to wear it. Clothing became a social signal, a boundary between honor and dishonor. Childbearing was both expectation and danger. Many women spent their adult lives in cycles of pregnancy, childbirth and nursing. The survival of children was uncertain. Disease, poor sanitation, and limited medical knowledge meant that infant mortality was high. Women bore the burden not only of their own risk in childbirth but also the emotional weight of children often lost young. Fertility was celebrated in art and myth, but in reality it was a fragile blessing. Goddesses like Inanna and Ninasag embodied fertility in divine form, yet mortal women bore the physical cost of that expectation. Yet not all women lived within stable households. Some were widowed, some divorced, some abandoned. Divorce was permitted under Mesopotamian law, usually at the husband's instigation, and though dowries could offer some protection, the outcome often left women economically vulnerable. Slavery was a constant presence as well, with women captured in war or sold by families under debt, their labor and bodies controlled by others. These women stood outside the fragile shelter of kinship, and were most at risk of exploitation. The Mesopotamian legal codes reveal much about women's position by the way they were regulated. Laws of Hammurabi and earlier codes of Ur-Nammu detail punishments for adultery, for false accusations, for disputes over marriage contracts. Women's voices rarely appear directly, instead the male perspective defines their rights and limits. For wives, respectability meant protection, but it also meant confinement within the expectations of obedience and fidelity. For daughters it meant transition from father's household to husband's. For widows it meant uncertainty, unless they had sons to guard their interests. Household life was often shared across generations. Grandparents, parents, children and servants clustered within compounds of mud brick, rooms arranged around open courtyards where cooking fires burned and water jars were stored. In these courtyards, women carried out much of their work weaving, cooking, washing, caring for children. Privacy was limited. Life unfolded within shared spaces, rhythms dictated by necessity rather than preference. Even in the bustle of city streets, a woman's world was largely circumscribed by the home and its obligations. Still, women participated in markets, especially those tied to food and textiles. Archaeological records show women engaging in trade of beer and cloth, their presence part of the hum of economic exchange. But again, their roles were constrained by law and custom. Respectable wives were not expected to linger in public places, while taverns often associated with prostitution were spaces of disrepute. The line between market woman and tavern woman could be thin, but socially it was heavily policed. Religion, too, shaped women's roles. Some women served in temples, not as prostitutes as popular imagination once claimed, but as priestesses, singers or administrators. These women, particularly those of elite families, lived lives distinct from ordinary wives, but their independence was still framed by devotion to gods and the authority of priests. The debated question of sacred prostitution likely reflects misunderstandings of Mesopotamian rituals, yet it underscores how women's sexuality was linked in outsider accounts to religious life. Through all these roles, wife, mother, brewer, weaver, servant, priestess, a thread runs clear. Women's status depended upon belonging. To be attached to a household was to have protection and place. To be without it was to stand exposed in a world where law and custom offered little shelter. And it was precisely in this exposed condition that prostitution emerged as both possibility and burden. Women who had no household, who had been cast out or enslaved, who had debts to repay or mouths to feed, turned to selling what could not be taken away from them, though it came at great cost. The land between rivers thus offered two starkly different experiences: the respectable security of women cloaked in veils within households, and the precarious lives of those left to the streets and taverns. To understand why prostitution became such a constant presence in Mesopotamian cities, one must follow these women at the margins, whose survival led them into a profession that society at once relied upon and despised. In the long arc of Mesopotamian history, professions were shaped not only by skill but by necessity. Just as men became scribes, carpenters or merchants, and women took up weaving, brewing or service within temples, so too did prostitution take its place as a recognized, if stigmatized, occupation. It was never celebrated, yet it was acknowledged, tolerated, and regulated in ways that reveal how deeply it was interwoven with the life of cities. The earliest traces of prostitution appear not in elaborate inscriptions or mythic poetry, but in the practical language of cuneiform tablets. Contracts, debts and laws mention women described as harem-tu, kodishtu, and shamhatu, words that carried different shades of meaning, some referring to independent prostitutes, others to temple women and still others to figures existing at the blurred line between the sacred and the profane. These mentions were not literary flourishes. They were written in the careful wedge-shaped strokes of scribes pressed into clay to be stored as records. The mere fact that they appear in such administrative contexts demonstrates that prostitution was not an invisible or hidden trade, but one acknowledged by the structures of law and economy. The growth of prostitution can be traced to the conditions of urban life. In villages, kinship networks sustained the vulnerable, and subsistence farming allowed families to manage with little surplus. But in the cities, the anonymity of crowded streets, the instability of wage labor, and the constant presence of debt created gaps into which prostitution took root. Women without family protection, widows, divorcees, slaves, or those whose households collapsed under financial strain, could find in prostitution a grim form of survival. Payment might come in coin, barley or beer, but it was a transaction recognized by all. There was also a connection, though often misunderstood, between prostitution and the temples. Some women associated with temples engaged in roles that outsiders later described as sacred prostitution. The Babylonian historian Herodotus, writing centuries later, claimed that every woman in Babylon was once required to sit in the temple of Ishtar and give herself to a stranger as a ritual offering. Modern scholarship, however, views this claim with skepticism, suggesting that Herodotus misunderstood Mesopotamian practices. Still, the persistence of such stories hints at the blurred boundaries between sexuality, ritual, and commerce in these societies. Women attached to temples may have had different functions, some administrative, some musical, some ritual, but prostitution became tangled in the memory of their roles, perhaps because sexuality was never fully divorced from religious symbolism. Economic necessity was the sharper reality. Laws from Hammurabi's code mention prostitutes directly, particularly in connection with taverns. These establishments were not merely places to drink beer, they were gathering spots where food, drink and sex could all be purchased. Women who worked there occupied an ambiguous space, both service providers and social outcasts. The law did not ignore them, it regulated their behavior, forbade them from wearing veils, punished them for certain infractions, but in doing so, it recognized their profession as a constant presence in the city. The perception of prostitutes was layered. On one hand, they were considered dishonorable, marked by their exclusion from respectable roles. On the other, they were necessary, their services sought by men across classes. This contradiction, the simultaneous reliance upon and rejection of prostitutes, made their lives precarious. They were tolerated as long as they remained in their place, yet scorned if they sought to cross the boundaries into respectability. Their children, too, bore the weight of this stigma, often excluded from inheritance or legal recognition. Literary sources also reveal glimpses of prostitution's place in society. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the prostitute Shamhat plays a pivotal role in civilizing the wild man Enkidu. She offers him her body, but through this act he gains not just sexual experience but knowledge of human society, how to eat bread, how to drink beer, how to clothe himself, how to enter the city. Here, prostitution is framed not merely as a transaction but as a threshold between wilderness and civilization. Yet, while Shamhat's role in the epic is symbolic and central, real prostitutes bore none of that honor. The story elevates her for narrative purposes, but the lived reality of women like her was marked by hardship. Archaeological traces, while scarce, further suggest prostitution's place as a recognized trade. Small terracotta figurines of nude women, sometimes interpreted as fertility symbols, may also reflect the commodification of female sexuality. Records of debts, payments in beer, or transactions tied to taverns occasionally include references to women who provided sexual services. These are not grand monuments but the minor residues of daily life, the quiet reminders that prostitution was part of the economy, recorded in the same script that tallied sheep or measured barley. The existence of prostitution as a profession did not erase its stigma, rather it entrenched it. By writing prostitutes into laws and contracts, society acknowledged them but also kept them at arm's length. They were counted, but rarely honored, recorded, but seldom named. This balance of recognition and exclusion set the stage for their role in Mesopotamian society, present in every city, central to its hidden economies, yet marked by shame and marginalization. And as this profession took root, so too did the stories that surrounded it, stories that blurred ritual, morality and commerce into one ambiguous thread. The temple loomed large in these associations, not always as a literal site of prostitution, but as a symbolic backdrop where questions of sex, divinity and society became entangled. The association of prostitution with temples in Mesopotamia has cast a long shadow, stretching from the ancient scribes who wrote fragments of ritual practice to the later Greek historians who described Babylon with a mixture of fascination and moral judgment. It is a subject entangled in myth, misinterpretation, and the blurred boundaries between sacred duty and human desire. To trace this debate is to wander through corridors of clay tablets, fragments of inscriptions, and the lingering voices of outsiders who looked upon Mesopotamian religion with puzzled eyes. Much of the confusion begins with Herodotus, the Greek historian writing in the 5th century BCE. In his histories he claimed that every woman in Babylon was required, at least once in her life, to sit within the temple of Ishtar and offer herself to a stranger, the price determined by the goddess. Only after completing this act could she return home, her duty fulfilled. For Herodotus, this ritual represented a society shockingly different from his own, a land where sex and religion mingled openly under divine sanction. His account, repeated by later writers, cemented the idea of sacred prostitution in the popular imagination, a notion that persisted for centuries. Yet when one turns to the Mesopotamian sources themselves, the evidence is far less certain. The thousands of cuneiform tablets uncovered from temples, palaces and archives speak extensively of offerings, rituals, sacrifices, hymns and priestly duties. They record lists of grain, herds, perfumes, and precious stones dedicated to the gods. They name priestesses, musicians, and temple servants who carried out roles in worship. What they do not provide, however, is clear confirmation of a system of ritualized prostitution. The silence of the tablets is striking, and modern scholars have grown increasingly cautious, seeing Herodotus's account as likely colored by misunderstanding, exaggeration, or even deliberate moralizing. This is not to say that sexuality was absent from Mesopotamian religion. On the contrary, it was deeply present, woven into myth and ritual. The goddess Inanna, later known as Ishtar, embodied fertility, love and war, her myths filled with themes of desire, seduction, and union. Hymns dedicated to her describe sacred marriages between the goddess and kings, rituals symbolizing the fertility of the land itself. In these rites, sexuality was not hidden but celebrated, a metaphor for cosmic renewal. The sacred marriage ritual, likely enacted during the New Year festival, paired a priestess representing the goddess with the king, affirming both political authority and agricultural abundance. But this was not prostitution in the commercial sense. It was ritual theater, sanctified union, and myth embodied in ceremony. Some scholars suggest that temple women, known by terms such as Kadishtu or Antu, may have been celibate priestesses, their sexuality symbolically aligned with the goddess, but not enacted in transactions with ordinary men. Others interpret the ambiguous terms differently, proposing that some temple women might have engaged in sexual rites as part of fertility worship. The truth may lie in the spectrum of practices, varied across centuries and cities, where some rituals included symbolic union, while most temple duties were administrative, musical, or ceremonial. The debate itself underscores a deeper point. sexuality and divinity were never far apart in Mesopotamian imagination. Myths celebrated Inanna's descent into the underworld, where her nakedness symbolized vulnerability and transformation. Hymns praised her erotic power, her ability to bestow desire upon gods and mortals alike. Figurines and plaques often depicted nude female figures, their exaggerated features interpreted as symbols of fertility or divine femininity. To live in Mesopotamia was to inhabit a world where sex was not merely private but cosmological, tied to the cycles of land, harvest and kingship. For ordinary prostitutes, however, the temple's shadow was double-edged. On one hand, the association with divinity gave a faint echo of dignity to their profession. Outsiders could claim that their acts mirrored sacred unions, that their role echoed the goddess's embrace. On the other hand, the institutional religion of temples did little to shield them from stigma. Prostitutes who worked in taverns or streets were excluded from the respect accorded to priestesses. The difference between a temple woman and a tavern woman was vast, yet the lines blurred in the memories of later writers, who fused ritual with commerce and sanctity with survival. The persistence of the sacred prostitution debate reveals more about how later cultures viewed Mesopotamia than about how Mesopotamians viewed themselves. To the Greeks and Romans, stories of Babylonian women offering themselves in temples symbolized a world turned upside down, a place of excess, indulgence, and moral decay. These tales confirmed preconceptions about the East as exotic and corrupt, justifying cultural superiority. In reality, the practices of Mesopotamian temples were structured, bureaucratic, and tightly controlled, with women's roles carefully defined. The temple was a place of power, but also of discipline, its hierarchies preserving order more than indulgence. Even so, the echoes of sex and ritual could not be erased. The sacred marriage festival, though not prostitution, shows how kings and priestesses embodied cosmic sexuality as public spectacle. The very imagery of Inanna and Dumuzi, the goddess and her shepherd lover, permeated songs and poems, celebrated in households as much as in temples. Here was a vision of sex as fertile, divine and life-giving, far removed from the precarious exchanges of prostitutes in taverns. Yet the coexistence of these two realities, the exalted ritual and the degraded trade, helped shape the ambiguous perception of prostitution across Mesopotamian history. Thus, while the historical reality of sacred prostitution may never be fully resolved, its shadow continues to color our understanding of Mesopotamia. It reveals how religion, sexuality, and economy intertwined, how myths blurred into practices, and how outsiders shaped narratives that lingered long after temples fell into ruin. What is certain is that prostitutes themselves lived far from sacred ceremony. Their lives were not enshrined in hymns or immortalized in rituals, but instead bound by law, stigma, and necessity. To understand their position more clearly, one must turn to the codes of justice carved into stone, where their profession was given shape, not in myth, but in punishment. The temple stood as a place of ritual ambiguity, filled with myths of cosmic unions and echoes of misunderstood practices. But beyond those walls, in the streets and marketplaces of Mesopotamian cities, the realities of daily life were governed not by hymns but by the steady authority of law, and nowhere was this more clearly expressed than in the Great Code of Hammurabi, inscribed in stone nearly 4,000 years ago, and still regarded as one of humanity's earliest and most complete legal documents. It was not only a declaration of justice, but also a mirror of social hierarchy, delineating the boundaries of honor, shame, and survival. For prostitutes, tavern keepers, and vulnerable women, its words carried both recognition and condemnation, shaping how they lived and how they were remembered. The Code of Hammurabi, compiled around 1754 BCE, under the reign of the sixth king of Babylon, contained 282 laws carved into a tall basalt stele. At its summit, the king is depicted receiving the rod and ring of authority from Shamash, the sun god of justice, a symbolic image declaring that the laws themselves were divinely sanctioned. Below, in small, tightly arranged cuneiform, the laws proceed with an unflinching detail, addressing everything from irrigation rights and theft to inheritance and marriage. For the historian, they are invaluable, not because they describe ideals, but because they reveal fears, disputes, and punishments that structured ordinary life. Among these laws are passages directly tied to prostitution and taverns, offering a stark picture of how the profession was viewed. Law 110 declares, "If a priestess who is not living in a cloister opens a tavern or enters a tavern for drink, she shall be burned to death." The severity of this punishment is striking, not only for its violence, but for what it reveals. The tavern was considered a morally dangerous place, where alcohol, sex, and unregulated transactions could blur the boundaries of order. For a woman consecrated to divine service to enter such a space was not merely a transgression, but a desecration, one punishable by fire. Taverns themselves were central to the association between prostitution and law. Women often ran these establishments, serving beer brewed from barley and emmer wheat, and sometimes offering sexual services alongside drink. The connection was strong enough that tavern keepers were repeatedly singled out for regulation. They were warned against cheating customers with false measures of beer, forbidden from harboring conspirators, and tied by implication to prostitution. This dual role, provider of sustenance and symbol of disorder, made the tavern a focal point of suspicion, and those who worked within it bore the weight of that suspicion daily. For prostitutes, the code reveals not protections but restrictions. Law 178, for instance, concerns inheritance, specifying that children born to a prostitute or a slave woman did not enjoy the same rights as those born to a legal wife. This was more than a financial exclusion. It was a social branding that ensured the stigma of prostitution extended into the next generation. The dishonor of the mother was carried by the child, a reminder that the law preserved not only order, but also the hierarchies of legitimacy and respectability. Even clothing became a marker of legal status. Prostitutes were forbidden to wear veils, a privilege reserved for respectable wives and daughters. The veil was not simply a garment but a sign of protection, an outward expression of honor, and the shielding of female sexuality within the household. To veil a prostitute was to grant her respect she was not permitted to claim, and punishments for such transgressions could be severe. Thus, even in appearance, prostitutes were legally distinguished from other women, forced into visibility in a society where concealment was a mark of virtue. The code does contain occasional glimpses of what might be considered protections, but these were rare and conditional. Prostitutes were recognized as debtors or creditors, able to engage in contracts, suggesting some legal agency in economic matters. Yet the overwhelming tone of the laws was not one of support but of control, ensuring that their roles remained circumscribed. The law acknowledged their existence but also codified their marginality, weaving stigma into the very structure of justice. Beyond the specific laws mentioning prostitutes, the code reflects broader attitudes toward women's vulnerability. Marital laws allowed men wide latitude to divorce wives for infertility, neglect, or misconduct, often leaving women financially exposed. Adultery was punished by drowning, a punishment that applied disproportionately to women. In such a climate, prostitution was not merely a profession but often the last option for survival, and the law's harsh stance ensured that this survival was accompanied by permanent dishonor. What is most striking, however, is the duality of recognition and exclusion. By writing prostitutes and tavern keepers into law, Hammurabi acknowledged their unavoidable presence in the fabric of urban life. They were not hidden or ignored, they were regulated, controlled, punished, and marked. This duality, visibility without dignity, ensured that while their existence was preserved in stone, their humanity was diminished. The law remembered them, but only as cautionary figures, symbols of disorder rather than individuals with stories of their own. The shadows of these laws linger across time. They remind us that Mesopotamian society, often celebrated for its innovations in writing, mathematics, and governance, was also a world where justice was not evenly applied, where class and gender dictated the boundaries of survival. Prostitutes occupied one of the lowest rungs of this order, their lives tolerated but stigmatized, their children excluded, their movements restricted. To be a prostitute in Mesopotamia was to live under the shadow of law, visible yet dishonored, necessary yet condemned. As the code etched these realities into stone, it created a framework that would echo through centuries, shaping not only the lives of prostitutes but the perception of their place in society. And while Hammurabi's laws are often studied as symbols of early justice, for those caught in their harsher clauses, they were less a shield than a branding iron, pressing stigma deep into both body and memory. From here, the story does not end with law alone. After the stele was carved and set up for all to see, daily life in taverns and households continued, filled with the hum of barter, the clatter of cups, and the whispered exchanges of survival. To step into these spaces is to see how prostitutes lived under the weight of law, navigating not only the fear of punishment, but also the daily demands of their profession. The laws etched into Hammurabi's stele made clear that taverns were sites of danger, suspicion, and punishment. Yet to understand why such attention was given to them, one must step into their interiors, into the smoky and dimly lit spaces where beer flowed in clay cups, where gossip traveled more quickly than written tablets, and where women often labored under both economic necessity and social contempt. For many prostitutes, the tavern was not only their place of work, but also the boundary of their lives, shaping their daily rhythms, their relationships, and their risks. The tavern in Mesopotamia was not simply a place for drink. Beer, made from fermented barley or emmer wheat, was the staple beverage of the region, consumed by rich and poor alike. It was safer than water, nourishing as food, and central to ritual offerings. Brewing was often a female profession, and women frequently became tavern keepers, selling beer in exchange for silver, barley, or labor. But alongside this trade in drink, another form of commerce emerged, sex, and the tavern became associated not only with conviviality, but with prostitution. Descriptions of taverns are sparse, yet enough traces remain to evoke their atmosphere. They were usually small, often a single-room establishment, their walls blackened with smoke from oil lamps and cooking fires. The air would have been thick, carrying the scent of beer mash, sweat, and dust. The floor, packed earth or rough brick, absorbed spills and stains. Low tables, benches, or mats provided seating, and clay cups passed from hand to hand as customers bargained for drink, food, or companionship. It was in this space, half domestic, half commercial, that prostitutes often worked, their presence both tolerated and scorned. The social position of tavern women was precarious. To enter the tavern was to step into a world outside respectability. Respectable wives did not drink there, nor did veiled women. The tavern was the haunt of laborers, soldiers, travelers, and men seeking distraction after the day's toil. It was also, according to the law, a place where conspiracies might be hatched and crimes plotted, a hub of subversion as much as of pleasure. This suspicion bled into how women who worked there were viewed not only as impure but as dangerous, capable of leading men astray from their duties to household, city, or temple. For prostitutes, the tavern offered access to customers but little protection. Unlike priestesses in temple households or women under family guardianship, they worked in a space with fragile boundaries. Violence was a constant risk. Payment might be withheld, promises broken, insults thrown. The law recognized the tavern as a site of disorder, but it did not protect the women inside it. Instead, it marked them as complicit in that disorder. Law 110's harsh warning against priestesses drinking in taverns reflects this atmosphere. These were not places where sanctity could survive. The women themselves were bound by visible markers. They were forbidden from wearing veils, which meant that in taverns their faces were open, their identities exposed. This exposure was both practical and symbolic. Practical, because it allowed men to distinguish prostitutes from wives or daughters. Symbolic, because it denied prostitutes the social protection of concealment. A veiled woman carried the honor of a household, an unveiled woman carried the mark of availability. Thus, the tavern became a stage where these social boundaries were enacted, where every piece of clothing and every gesture reinforced status. The work itself was layered. A tavern keeper might brew and serve beer while also offering sex, or she might employ other women for this purpose. Payment came not only in silver but in goods, grain, oil, or even labor pledged in kind. Records from debt tablets suggest that women sometimes became entangled in cycles of obligation, where unpaid debts could force them deeper into dependence on tavern labor. The tavern was not simply a place of work. It could become a trap. binding women to a livelihood that reinforced their exclusion from other roles. Yet the tavern was also a point of intersection, where men and women from different classes might encounter each other in ways the formal structures of society rarely allowed. A merchant could sit beside a soldier, a laborer beside a scribe, all joined by drink and the fleeting company of women. In this sense, the tavern disrupted the ordered hierarchies of Mesopotamian society, collapsing distinctions, if only for an evening, into the haze of beer. But this very disruption is what made it so feared and so closely regulated by law. Cultural echoes of taverns appear even in literature. The figure of Siduri in the Epic of Gilgamesh is a tavern keeper, who offers the hero advice on embracing life's simple pleasures, eating, drinking, cherishing family. Her role is symbolic rather than commercial, yet her placement as a tavern woman reflects the association of such figures with wisdom mingled with marginality. Siduri's advice is tender, but her status is liminal, living at the edges of the world, just as real tavern women lived at the edges of society. For prostitutes in taverns, life was shaped by contrasts. They were essential yet dishonored, visible yet despised, central to the urban economy yet excluded from its respectability. Their workplaces were filled with sound, the hum of voices, the scrape of cups, the crackle of lamps, but their lives were often marked by silence in the historical record, preserved only in the fragments of laws or the disdain of moralists. The tavern then was not simply a building, it was a microcosm of Mesopotamian contradictions, a space where necessity and pleasure mingled, where women labored in shadows cast by the brightness of temples and palaces. It was a place of survival, but also of branding, where prostitutes were seen less as individuals and more as symbols of disorder. And as they moved through its smoky air, serving beer and bodies, they carried the weight of laws that defined them, stripping them of honor while never freeing them from demand. From here, to follow their story further is to look beyond the tavern walls into the wider streets of Mesopotamian cities, where the prostitute's presence was inescapable, yet always marginal, shaping how they were seen not only by customers but by neighbors, by scribes, and by the society that kept them forever outside its circle of respectability. The tavern was a workplace defined by smoke, noise, and exposure, a space where women labored under the visible markers of dishonor. But the walls of the tavern were not boundaries of stigma, they were simply its most concentrated form. Beyond its doors, in the crowded lanes of Babylon, or Nineveh, prostitutes carried the mark of their trade wherever they went, not always in the open of their faces, but in the silent judgments of neighbors, in the structures of law, and in the subtle exclusions that shaped civic life. If the tavern made them visible, society made them vulnerable. The stigma attached to prostitution in Mesopotamia was both practical and symbolic. On a practical level, prostitutes occupied the lowest rungs of female status, their work defined by necessity rather than honor. A wife might bring her husband wealth through dowry, legitimacy through children, and respect through her veiled presence in public. A prostitute brought none of these. She belonged to no household, offered no guarantee of inheritance, and carried no veil to signal protection. The absence of these markers placed her outside the circles of kinship and respect that gave Mesopotamian women their fragile but real security. Marriage was among the clearest boundaries. While men could seek the services of prostitutes without threatening their own honor, a prostitute herself could not marry into respectability. The stigma of her trade followed her into every potential union, closing the doors to households that might otherwise provide protection. Even if she left prostitution, her past was not erased. The visibility of her unveiled presence, the reputation of her tavern work, and the exclusion of her children from inheritance all reinforced a lasting dishonor. A prostitute could bear children, but those children were denied legitimacy, trapped in the margins alongside their mother. Legal testimony further exposed this marginalization. In Mesopotamian courts, not all voices carried equal weight. A man of standing, a free wife, or a recognized citizen could offer testimony respected by the scribes. But prostitutes, like slaves and certain other outcasts, were often restricted or excluded from testifying in legal disputes. Their words were tainted by dishonor, their credibility undermined by their status. This silencing extended beyond the courtroom, shaping how they moved through civic life. To be a prostitute was not merely to be dishonored in private judgment. It was to be legally branded as unreliable, an outsider in matters of justice. Civic exclusion was equally present in the rhythms of daily life. Temples, with their processions and festivals, gathered the community into shared acts of worship. Markets drew together farmers, merchants, and craftsmen. Households linked kin through marriages and feasts. In each of these arenas, prostitutes were present, but peripheral, their roles transactional rather than communal. They provided services, but they were not included in the bonds of exchange that defined belonging. To live as a prostitute was to live in the shadow of society, necessary yet never embraced. The symbolism of veiling, so central in Hammurabi's laws, reinforced this exclusion in a visible way. Respectable women wore veils to signal their connection to households, their sexuality shielded and controlled within family structures. Prostitutes, barred from veiling, bore their dishonor on their bodies. To walk unveiled was to be recognized at a glance as outside respectability, available yet unprotected. This enforced visibility was itself a form of control, ensuring that prostitutes could not blur the boundaries between their lives and those of wives or daughters. The veil was honor, and to be denied it was to carry permanent shame. This stigma shaped not only how society treated prostitutes, but how they might view themselves. In literature, when prostitutes appeared, they were often symbols rather than individuals. Shamhat civilizing Enkidu, Siduri, offering wisdom to Gilgamesh. In these portrayals, prostitutes were liminal figures, useful, even essential, but never fully integrated. They existed at thresholds between wilderness and civilization, between despair and counsel, between pleasure and shame. Yet outside literature, real prostitutes bore the harsher side of this liminality. They were never allowed to cross the threshold into respectability. The liminal was not a passage for them, but a permanent condition. Economic survival was the backdrop to this dishonor. Prostitutes worked because they had little choice, because households had failed, debts had mounted, or protection had vanished. Yet necessity did not soften stigma. If anything, it deepened it. Society recognized the economic functions of prostitution, regulating it through laws and taxes, but refused to grant dignity to those who performed it. This contradiction was central. Prostitutes were tolerated because they were needed, yet dishonored because they were seen as destabilizing the ideals of family and order. For their children, stigma was inherited. Laws excluded them from inheritance, reinforcing their mother's dishonor across generations. A prostitute's daughter might be forced into the same trade, her options limited by lack of dowry and lack of recognition. Thus, the dishonor of prostitution was not confined to individuals but extended through bloodlines, ensuring that marginalization was perpetuated. The weight of stigma was not only personal, but generational. The silence of prostitutes in the historical record deepens this sense of marginality. We have their names only rarely, preserved in contracts or debt lists, often as creditors or debtors, but seldom as individuals with agency beyond transactions. They do not appear in hymns, except symbolically, and they do not speak in the epics, except through archetypes. Their voices are lost, their experiences filtered through the perspectives of lawgivers, moralists, and poets. This absence is itself a mark of stigma, a reminder that their humanity was recorded only at the edges, never at the center. The weight of this dishonor is not simply a historical curiosity. It shaped every aspect of their daily lives. Where they could walk, what they could wear, how they could speak, whom they could marry, and what their children could inherit. It marked them in the law, in the marketplace, in the tavern, and in the home. It was a stigma that followed them from the moment they stepped into prostitution until the end of their lives, a weight that society never allowed them to set down. And yet, despite this marginalization, prostitutes remained part of the urban fabric. Men continued to seek their services. Temples and taverns continued to employ them, and the economy continued to rely upon their labor. They were dishonored, but they could not be erased. Their presence, tolerated yet condemned, became one of the defining contradictions of Mesopotamian society. From here, To understand more fully the lives of these women, one must turn to the men who sought them out, the soldiers, the merchants, and the strangers whose patronage sustained the trade, while reinforcing the dishonor that came with it. If dishonor and exclusion were the invisible burdens prostitutes carried, the visible burden was written on their bodies. The stigma marked them in law and custom, but disease marked them in flesh, often in ways that compounded their marginality and shortened their lives. In Mesopotamia, a land where medicine existed in fragments, half practical remedies, half incantations, those who labored in prostitution faced the compounded dangers of poverty, poor health, and the absence of effective care. Their bodies became the stage upon which the hardships of their trade played out, silently deteriorating under conditions neither they nor their society fully understood. The evidence for venereal disease in ancient Mesopotamia is fragmentary, as is much of ancient medicine, but there are traces in the clay tablets left by physicians and scribes. The collections of medical texts, like the Diagnostic Handbook, attributed to Esagil-Kinapli in the late 2nd millennium BCE, catalogued illnesses with painstaking care, describing symptoms and offering prognoses. Among them are references to sores, discharges, swellings, and fevers that modern scholars interpret as possible signs of sexually transmitted infections. While no single description can be linked with absolute certainty to later known venereal diseases, the clustering of these symptoms in texts dealing with reproductive and sexual health suggests that Mesopotamian prostitutes were indeed vulnerable to such conditions. The treatments available were mixtures of herbal remedies and ritual incantations. Barley, dates, oils, and resins might be applied to affected areas. Spells invoking deities such as Gula, the goddess of healing, might be recited. But without an understanding of infection or transmission, these remedies could only soothe symptoms, never address causes. A woman suffering from chronic discharge or ulcerated sores might receive poultices or prayers, but her condition would persist, marking her as both physically unwell and ritually unclean. Illness deepened the stigma already attached to her trade, making her less desirable to clients and more vulnerable to further poverty. Beyond venereal disease, the general health of prostitutes was shaped by their circumstances of poverty and exposure. Taverns where many worked were smoky, crowded spaces with poor sanitation. The water supply of Mesopotamian cities, though ingeniously channeled through canals, was easily contaminated by waste. In such environments, gastrointestinal illnesses were common, weakening the body over time. Malnutrition was another constant companion. A prostitute working without household support might subsist on bread and beer, lacking the varied diet available to those tied to farms or wealthier families. Weakness, susceptibility to infection, and premature aging were the natural outcomes of such deprivation. Pregnancy, too, was a frequent hazard. Unlike wives, who might have the support of a household and midwives, prostitutes bore the dangers of childbirth, often without assistance or security. Abortion methods, crudely described in some texts, were dangerous and unreliable. Infants born to prostitutes faced uncertain survival, and even if they lived, they inherited the dishonor of their mother's status. Maternal mortality was already high in ancient societies. For prostitutes, the risks were magnified by neglect and lack of kin support. A single complicated birth could end a life, reducing a woman's years of labor to a brief span. Infections of all kinds worsened the toll. Without knowledge of bacteria or contagion, wounds from violence, miscarriages, or childbirth often became fatal through sepsis. Prostitutes, frequently exposed to rough treatment by clients or guards, lived with a constant threat of untreated injuries. For them, illness was not a rare misfortune, but a regular shadow. The body constantly strained by overwork, malnutrition, violence, and exposure. The link between poverty and illness was inexorable. Prostitutes were often those who had fallen through society's safety nets, widows without dowry, abandoned wives, debtors without kin to redeem them. Poverty drove them into the trade, and the trade deepened their poverty through illness and dishonor. Each illness reduced their ability to attract clients. Each absence of clients reduced their income. Each decline in income worsened their ability to afford food or remedies. It was a cycle of decline that trapped them in a downward spiral, rarely escaped. The absence of medical knowledge compounded this cycle. Mesopotamian physicians, learned men who studied in temples and palaces, might be consulted by wealthier families, but prostitutes had neither the money nor the social standing to access such expertise. Instead, they were more likely to rely on local healers, herbalists or midwives, whose practices blended folk knowledge with fragments of official medicine. Some remedies may have offered real relief, herbs with antibacterial properties for example, but without systematic knowledge, results were inconsistent and often too little, too late. But the mental burden of illness was equally heavy. To live with constant pain, sores or discharges, was to be visibly marked as unclean, rejected by both clients and society. The shame of dishonor was magnified by the shame of visible disease, reinforcing exclusion at every level. In a culture where health was tied to divine favor, illness was often interpreted as a punishment or curse, further isolating the sufferer. A prostitute afflicted by disease carried not only the burden of physical pain, but also the weight of suspicion that she was cursed, guilty of some hidden transgression beyond her trade. Yet, despite this burden, the profession endured. New women entered as others declined, driven by the same forces of poverty, displacement and desperation. The cycle of illness and decline was not a deterrent, because the need for survival outweighed the risks. Society's tolerance of prostitution, shaped by demand from soldiers, merchants and travelers, ensured that the trade continued, even if the women themselves bore shortened, difficult lives. Thus, the decline of prostitutes was not simply personal, but structural, embedded in the very fabric of Mesopotamian society. They were necessary, but expendable, tolerated, but never protected. Their bodies bore the cost of an institution that served others' needs, while offering them little in return beyond survival for as long as their health allowed. From this recognition of decline, it becomes necessary to examine the other side of the transaction: the men whose patronage sustained the trade, the soldiers stationed in distant garrisons, the merchants arriving from foreign lands, and the strangers whose coin paid for the women's survival, while entrenching their stigma. If illness and decline marked the inevitable end for many prostitutes, the beginning of their journey into the trade was rarely shaped by choice. It was shaped instead by the inescapable gravity of necessity. In Mesopotamia, where families were fragile units dependent upon land, labor, and marriage alliances, the disruption of any of these foundations could cast women adrift. Widowhood, slavery, and debt bondage, each a common feature of the ancient world, were among the most frequent paths that led women into prostitution, transforming personal misfortune into structural vulnerability. Widowhood was one of the most precarious positions a woman could occupy in Mesopotamian society. A wife's honor was tied to her husband's household, her security to his land and resources. When he died, the widow might remain under the protection of her husband's family, provided she brought children to secure the lineage. But for those without children, or those whose husbands' families rejected them, the situation was more dire. A widow without dowry or sons to bind her into a household could be cast adrift, her options narrowing with each passing season. Some sought remarriage, but without dowry or beauty, prospects were limited. For many, prostitution was not a chosen path, but the only available one, the final means to survive in cities that could be as indifferent as they were crowded. Slavery was another conduit into prostitution. War captives, women taken from defeated cities, or those sold by impoverished families often found themselves enslaved in households or temples. While some slaves were tasked with domestic labor or weaving, others were forced into prostitution at the will of their masters. This was particularly common in taverns, where enslaved women were used to attract patrons and generate income. In these cases, prostitution was not merely an occupation but a condition imposed, a layer of exploitation atop the bondage already suffered. The enslaved prostitute bore dishonor compounded by lack of freedom, her body not her own, but an asset in the hands of another. Debt bondage created yet another avenue into prostitution. In Mesopotamia's credit-based economy, debts could quickly become overwhelming, particularly in times of poor harvest or flood. A family unable to repay its obligations might pledge a daughter into service, sometimes in domestic labor, sometimes in temple work, and sometimes inevitably into prostitution. For women so pledged, the stigma of dishonor was inseparable from the mark of debt. Her body transformed into collateral, These arrangements might be temporary, but the damage could be lasting. Even after the debt was paid, the woman's reputation bore the stain of her service, closing the door to respectable marriage and binding her to the margins. The pattern that emerges from these pathways is not one of choice, but of survival. Prostitution was rarely an aspiration. It was an endpoint reached when all other supports had collapsed. In a society that valued women primarily through household ties, through dowries, marriages, and sons, those excluded from these bonds had few means of survival. Weaving, brewing, and market selling provided some income, but these were often insufficient for women without kin or property. Prostitution filled the gap, offering immediate survival at the cost of long-term stigma. The city itself made this survival both possible and precarious. Urban centers like Uruk, Babylon, and Nineveh were places where strangers gathered, where demand for sexual services was constant. Soldiers stationed in garrisons, merchants traveling with caravans, and laborers working on canals created a steady flow of clients. For women without other means, this demand offered opportunity, however exploitative. The anonymity of the city also allowed women to enter the trade without the direct oversight of kin, though it exposed them to violence and exploitation in equal measure. Survival through prostitution also reveals the limited safety nets available to Mesopotamian women. Temples sometimes provided food or refuge, but these supports were often conditional and short-lived. Families could offer protection, but only if bonds of loyalty and resources held strong. Once those supports collapsed, women were largely left to fend for themselves in an urban world where opportunities for female independence were scarce. Prostitution in this sense was less a profession than a symptom of the fragility of women's security in ancient Mesopotamia. Even for those who entered prostitution for survival, the path was not uniform. Some worked independently, offering services in streets or near city gates. Others worked in taverns, bound either by employment or enslavement. A few, as suggested in some texts, may have operated under temple authority, though this remains debated among scholars. In every case, survival was the immediate goal, but survival came with a cost: dishonor, exclusion, and vulnerability to illness and violence. It is here that one sees most clearly the structural paradox of Mesopotamian society. The same system that drove women into prostitution also condemned them for engaging in it. Poverty, widowhood, slavery, and debt were recognized realities, yet the women who turned to prostitution in response were treated as dishonored, excluded from marriage, inheritance, and testimony. Survival was permitted, but respect was denied. This paradox ensured that prostitution remained both tolerated and stigmatized, necessary yet despised. At its core, prostitution in Mesopotamia reflects the fragility of survival in the ancient world. Women did not become prostitutes because they desired to, but because they had no other path left open. It was a profession born of collapse of family, collapse of fortune, collapse of health. It was survival at the margins, carried on day by day, transaction by transaction, without promise of security in the future. Yet this survival was not undertaken in isolation. For prostitution to exist, there had to be clients, men whose coin and demand sustained the trade, even as society condemned the women involved. Soldiers, merchants, and strangers passing through the cities of the land between rivers became both the enablers and the perpetuators of this fragile survival, shaping the rhythms of the trade in ways that reveal as much about Mesopotamian society as the women themselves. If prostitution was often the last recourse of free women who had lost their security, for enslaved women it was not a recourse at all, but an imposition. Survival was no choice for them. Their lives and bodies were defined as property, subject to the decisions of others. In Mesopotamia, slavery was a deeply entrenched institution, shaping not only households and labor, but also the hidden economy of sexual exploitation. For enslaved women, prostitution was frequently not survival, but coercion, another layer of violence imposed upon their already vulnerable existence. The roots of slavery in Mesopotamia lay in war, debt, and poverty. Captives taken from defeated cities, prisoners of raids along the frontiers, and individuals unable to pay their debts all flowed into the ranks of the enslaved. Men might be used for agricultural labor, construction, or temple service, but women were most often placed in domestic roles, cooking, weaving, grinding grain. Yet alongside these expected labors lay the reality that women's bodies themselves were considered part of their master's property, and thus available for use, sale, or hire. This blurred the boundaries between slavery and prostitution, for enslaved women could be compelled to engage in sexual service without their consent, either for their master's pleasure or for profit in taverns and brothels. The legal codes of Mesopotamia acknowledge this grim reality obliquely. The Code of Hammurabi outlines punishments for those who assault or abuse the wives and daughters of citizens, but it offers no such protections for enslaved women. Instead, the laws often treat them as property, subject to compensation, rather than persons entitled to justice. If an enslaved woman was harmed, her master received payment, not the woman herself. This legal framing made exploitation not only possible, but institutionally invisible, rendering the sexual use of slaves beyond the reach of censure. Taverns were a central setting for this exploitation. As drinking houses and informal brothels, they relied heavily on enslaved women, whose presence both drew in customers and provided sexual services. These women had no say in their labor. Their masters placed them in taverns to earn profit, whether through pouring beer, entertaining patrons, or selling their bodies. Unlike free prostitutes, who at least operated with a semblance of agency in choosing their clients, enslaved women were bound to obey orders, their bodies rented out in transactions from which they saw no gain. Their dishonor was doubled, dishonor as prostitutes, and dishonor as slaves, each compounding the other. Archaeological and textual fragments hint at the lives of these enslaved women. Contracts survive in which daughters were pledged into debt service, sometimes explicitly for tavern work. Lists of temple staff include female slaves who may have been required to engage in sexual activity as part of their duties, though the extent and nature of this remain debated. The absence of the women's own voices underscores their erasure. Their existence was recorded only as property catalogued in transactions and inventories. The physical toll on enslaved prostitutes was severe. Already subject to the hardships of servitude, long hours of labor, inadequate food, harsh punishment, these women bore additional burdens of sexual exploitation. Illness spread easily in taverns, and enslaved women, like free prostitutes, suffered from untreated infections and complications of childbirth. But unlike free women, who might leave prostitution when age or illness overtook them, enslaved women had no such option. Their lives remained bound until death, discarded when they could no longer serve their master's purposes. Violence was a constant presence. Masters held power of punishment over their slaves, and tavern environments were fraught with danger from drunken clients. An enslaved woman had no recourse against abuse. Her injuries were considered losses to her owner rather than wrongs against her person. Even death in such circumstances might merit only financial compensation to the master. This legal and social framework normalized a cycle of violence and exploitation, in which the humanity of enslaved women was systematically erased. Yet, paradoxically, enslaved prostitutes were also woven into the fabric of urban life. Taverns, sustained by their labor, were integral to the economy and social rhythms of Mesopotamian cities. Soldiers on leave, merchants from distant lands, and laborers seeking distraction all passed through tavern doors, encountering enslaved women whose labor underpinned the experience. These women, while invisible in records of honor and status, were present in the daily lives of countless men, their exploitation normalized as part of urban existence. The role of temples in this exploitation remains one of history's more troubling ambiguities. Some sources suggest that enslaved women attached to temples may have been involved in sexual service, either as a form of sacred duty or as a practical revenue stream. Whether or not temple prostitution was formalized, it is clear that temples, as large landholders and employers, owned slaves and could direct their labor as they saw fit. In such contexts, enslaved women may have found themselves compelled to serve not only their human masters, but also the demands of institutions claiming divine sanction. The interweaving of slavery and prostitution reveals the structural vulnerability of women in Mesopotamian society. Free women could fall into prostitution through misfortune, but enslaved women had no choice at all. They entered the world of sexual exploitation by compulsion, their survival tied to the will of others. Their dishonor was not only personal but systemic, an inescapable condition imposed by the laws, the economy, and the social order. The silence of their voices in history is perhaps the most striking testament to their marginalization. We know them only through the words of masters, scribes, and lawmakers. Their names, when recorded, appear in debt contracts or slave lists, not in hymns or epics. They do not offer counsel like Sajuri, nor civilize like Shamhat. They endure in shadows, their humanity flattened into transactions. Yet their labor was indispensable to the functioning of taverns, to the rhythms of soldiers' leisure, to the profits of masters, and to the survival of urban economies. For enslaved women, prostitution was not survival, but endurance. They endured until their bodies gave out, until they were replaced by others drawn from the endless cycles of war, poverty, and debt that replenished the ranks of the enslaved. Their suffering was hidden in plain sight, woven into the ordinary fabric of Mesopotamian life. And yet, while the enslaved bore the harshest realities of prostitution, the trade itself depended equally on those who demanded it. Soldiers, merchants, and strangers, moving through the cities of the land between rivers, were the constant patrons whose coin sustained both free and enslaved prostitution. Without their presence, the system could not have functioned, and the dishonor borne by women would not have been perpetuated. Though slavery exposed the darkest edge of prostitution, not all women who engaged in the trade occupied the same position. In Mesopotamia, as in many early societies, class distinctions were etched into every layer of life, and prostitution was no exception. Even among the dishonored, there were hierarchies, dividing those who held a measure of status and relative security from those who labored in the most precarious and degrading conditions. From higher status courtesans associated with temples or elites, to tavern women tied to smoky drinking houses, to the street prostitutes who wandered outside the gates, these classes formed a spectrum of existence that reveals how deeply prostitution was integrated into the fabric of Mesopotamian cities. At the upper end of this spectrum stood the women sometimes described in texts as Kordishtu, or consecrated women. The precise meaning of these terms remains debated by scholars, but they seem to have referred to a category of women who were set apart, often attached to temples or religious institutions. Some have interpreted them as sacred prostitutes, though this remains controversial. Others see them as priestesses or temple courtesans who may have engaged in ritualized forms of sexuality or companionship. Whatever their precise role, these women occupied a distinct position. Their connection to temples or elites granted them a measure of protection and status unavailable to ordinary prostitutes. Such women might have been educated, trained in music, or entrusted with ritual duties, making them part of the cultural and spiritual life of their communities. They lived not in the taverns or streets but in quarters tied to temples or wealthy households. Their clients, if they engaged in sexual relations at all, were likely elite men, priests, kings or officials, whose patronage provided them with resources and relative stability. For them, dishonor was blunted by association with sacred or elite institutions. They remained marginal to the norms of household respectability, but they were not entirely excluded from the networks of power and culture. In the middle tier were the tavern women. These were the prostitutes most directly associated with beer houses and inns, where they poured drink, entertained guests and sold sexual services. Their lives were far more precarious than those of temple courtesans. Bound to the smoky confines of taverns, they labored under constant scrutiny, regulated by laws that forbade them from wearing veils and subjected them to punishment for dishonesty or disorder. Their clients were soldiers, laborers, merchants and travelers, the transient populations that filled Mesopotamian cities with both opportunity and danger. The tavern women lived with little protection. Many were enslaved or debt-bonded, their earnings flowing not to themselves but to tavern keepers or masters. Even those who were technically free faced constant vulnerability, drunken violence, disease and poverty. Their work blurred the line between service and degradation, as they were both the purveyors of drink and the objects of desire, their bodies commodified in every transaction. Unlike temple courtesans, they had no claim to ritual respectability. Unlike free wives, they had no claim to household honor. They lived in the margins, tolerated yet despised, indispensable yet dishonored. At the bottom of this hierarchy were the street prostitutes. women who worked outside the walls of taverns and temples, offering themselves in alleys, near city gates, or on the edges of marketplaces. These women were the most exposed to danger, operating without even the fragile shelter of an institution. Their clients were the poorest men, or those seeking the anonymity of quick encounters far from the eyes of kin and community. For street prostitutes, survival was day by day, coin by coin. They had no protection, no steady place of work, and no recognition in law beyond the dishonor of their trade. The fates of these classes of prostitutes diverged sharply. Courtesans associated with temples or elites might secure gifts, stability, or even a degree of cultural memory, preserved in hymns or myths. Tavern women endured hard lives, often shortened by illness or violence, their names lost in the dust of tavern records. Street prostitutes, the most invisible of all, disappeared into anonymity, their lives unrecorded and their deaths unnoticed. Yet together, these classes formed a continuum, from the ritualized margins of respectability to the depths of dishonor, all bound by the common thread of exclusion from household and kinship structures. These divisions also reflected broader Mesopotamian attitudes towards sexuality and class. Just as wives, concubines and slaves occupied distinct roles in the household, so too did prostitutes occupy differentiated roles in the city. Status determined not only who a woman served but how her service was perceived. An elite man's liaison with a temple courtesan might be framed as sacred or refined. His visit to a tavern woman was tolerated but dishonored. His use of a street prostitute was hidden in shame. Thus, class distinctions shaped not only the lives of prostitutes, but also the reputations of the men who engaged with them. The existence of these divided classes underscores the adaptability of prostitution within Mesopotamian society. It was not a monolithic institution, but a spectrum of practices that intersected with religion, economy, and social order. In every case, however, prostitutes remained outside the boundaries of respectability, their status shaped less by personal agency than by the structures that surrounded them. Whether courtesan, tavern worker, or streetwalker, each carried the mark of dishonor, even if the weight of that mark varied. The persistence of these divisions also reveals how deeply prostitution was woven into the urban landscape. Temples, taverns, and markets, each a defining feature of Mesopotamian cities, were linked to different forms of prostitution. The courtesan's chamber, the tavern's smoky hall, and the shadowed alley all formed parts of the same continuum, each sustained by the demand of men from across the social spectrum. These spaces illustrate how prostitution, while stigmatized, was never peripheral. It was present in the heart of the city, shaping its rhythms and economies. Yet, however divided their conditions, prostitutes remained bound by the same underlying dependence on clients. Without the soldiers, merchants, and strangers whose coin sustained the trade, neither courtesans nor tavern women nor street prostitutes could have endured. The distinctions of class shaped their lives, but the men who sought them formed the common thread tying all classes together. In Mesopotamia, the divisions between courtesans, tavern women, and street prostitutes were stark enough, but perhaps the greater divide, the line that shaped a woman's fate more than any other, was the one that separated those who lived under the protection of households from those who did not. Kinship, in the land between the rivers, was not simply a matter of family ties, it was the foundation of security, the structure through which honor, resources, and survival were negotiated. To be a wife, a daughter, or even a concubine within a household was to exist within a framework of expectations and obligations, supported, however imperfectly, by law and custom. To live outside that framework, as prostitutes did, was to step into the fragile world of streets and taverns, where every day carried the weight of uncertainty. The Mesopotamian household was both physical and symbolic. It was made of mud brick walls and reed mats, but it was also constructed from names, reputations, and intergenerational ties. Within its walls, women's lives were defined by roles that were at once restrictive and protective. They wove cloth, brewed beer, baked bread, tended children, and kept the rituals that honored family gods. Their status was often circumscribed by men, fathers, husbands, or masters, but it was also stabilized by them. The household provided food, shelter, and recognition in the eyes of the community. It bound women into the structures of inheritance, debt arrangements, and legal identity. By contrast, those without households drifted in a space the Mesopotamians regarded with suspicion and disdain. Women unattached to kin, whether through widowhood, slavery, or rejection, found themselves vulnerable to poverty and dishonor. They were no longer shielded by the obligations that bound men to provide for their wives and daughters, nor could they invoke the authority of kin when wronged. In this liminal condition, prostitution emerged as both a symptom and a solution, a means of surviving without the safety net of family. Yet the price of this survival was stigma, for society viewed the unattached woman with suspicion, and her labor outside the home was cast as a mark of disgrace. The contrast between household and street shaped every perception of respectability. Wives and daughters were veiled in public, a visible sign of their belonging to a household. Prostitutes, tavern women, and slaves were forbidden by law from wearing veils, their bare heads a public proclamation of exclusion. This legal distinction was more than symbolic. It mapped women onto different moral geographies of the city. Veiled women moved within recognized routes, from home to market to temple, while unveiled women were relegated to taverns, alleys, and liminal spaces. The law itself reinforced this division, making visible the gulf between household security and the instability of the street. Life within the household was not necessarily kind or free of hardship. Women endured the strictures of patriarchal law, the risk of divorce, and the burdens of childbearing. Yet even in difficulty, they were tethered to networks of support. A divorced woman might return to her father's house. A widow might rely on sons or extended kin. These options, though imperfect, provided a measure of continuity. Prostitutes, on the other hand, rarely had such recourse. Once outside the household system, they became rootless, dependent on the coin of strangers rather than the duty of kin. The psychological weight of this division should not be understated. To belong to a household was to belong to a lineage, to have one's name inscribed in the clay tablets of inheritance, and to share in the rituals that bound generations together. To live on the street was to exist outside those tablets, unrecorded and unremembered. Prostitutes, like tavern women, rarely left behind names or legacies. Their labor produced no heirs, their existence no lasting household. They lived in the moment, in the precarious present, their futures uncertain and their pasts erased. This divide also influenced how men viewed their relationships with women. Wives and daughters were to be protected, their honor fiercely guarded, for the dishonor of one woman rippled outward to taint the reputation of an entire household. Prostitutes, by contrast, carried no such burden. A man's use of a prostitute did not dishonor his household in the same way as the violation of a wife or daughter would, precisely because prostitutes were seen as already dishonored, detached from kin. Yet this very detachment made them expendable, subject to mistreatment without recourse. Their exclusion from the household system rendered them vulnerable to abuse that carried no consequence for those who inflicted it. The household and the street were thus not merely physical locations but categories of existence, deeply etched into Mesopotamian life. They represented two ways of being a woman, one embedded in kinship and continuity, the other exposed to instability and erasure. Prostitution in this context was less a profession freely chosen than a condition produced by exclusion from the household. It was the shadow that stretched wherever kinship ties failed, a reminder of what lay beyond the protective walls of family. And yet, even as prostitutes stood outside the household, their existence illuminated its boundaries. They marked what it meant to be respectable by embodying what it meant to fall outside respectability. Their visibility in taverns and streets reminded every veiled wife and daughter of the fragility of her own position. In this way, the lives of prostitutes and the lives of household women were not entirely separate but bound together by contrast, each defining the other. It was this contrast that gave prostitution its peculiar place in Mesopotamian society. Tolerated yet despised, ubiquitous yet marginalized. The household needed the street, just as the city needed its taverns and markets. Prostitutes, though excluded from kinship structures, were woven into the broader fabric of urban life, serving the soldiers, merchants, and strangers who passed through the city gates. The divide between the household and the street, visible in the laws and customs of Mesopotamia, is made more tangible still when one turns to the archaeological traces of prostitution. Unlike kings and priests, whose deeds were carved in monumental inscriptions, or merchants whose names filled the ledgers of trade, prostitutes left behind no great texts of their own. Their lives were not preserved in self-authored chronicles, nor celebrated in official hymns. What remains of them emerges instead in fragments, scattered through graffiti, scratched onto walls, clay tablets recording debts and payments, small figurines left in houses or temples, and the faint echoes of their existence in administrative accounts. These traces, while sparse and indirect, are enough to sketch the shadows of lives lived at the margins of Mesopotamian cities. Clay, the most humble of Mesopotamian materials, provides some of the clearest glimpses. In the ledgers of debts and payments, written in cuneiform on small tablets, there appear notations that suggest the entanglement of prostitutes in the economy. Some tablets record payments of silver for services rendered, or obligations of debt tied to women who worked in taverns. These documents, dry and formulaic, make no judgments. They reduce human labor to units of silver or barley, recording the transaction without sentiment. Yet in their very bluntness, they testify to the commodification of women's bodies, showing how sex work was woven into the networks of exchange that sustained city life. A line etched on clay, tallying a debt owed to a tavern keeper, becomes a quiet witness to an encounter long vanished. Small figurines also hint at the role of prostitutes in Mesopotamian society. Many terracotta figures of women, often nude or partially clothed, have been uncovered in domestic and ritual contexts. Scholars debate their meaning. Some may have been fertility charms, others votive offerings, still others representations of prostitutes themselves. The figures are not grand in scale but small, easily held in the hand or placed on a household altar. Their exaggerated forms suggest that they were meant to symbolize not individuals but archetypes, perhaps the generic image of female sexuality. If some were indeed representations of prostitutes, they suggest how sexuality, commerce and ritual could blur in the daily life of the city, reduced to clay images that embodied both desire and devotion. Graffiti, though rare, provides an even more direct window. Scratched into walls or tablets, crude drawings of sexual encounters have occasionally been found. These are not the official records of scribes, but the spontaneous marks of anonymous hands. They hint at the places where prostitutes may have worked, the taverns, inns and alleyways where soldiers and laborers gathered. In these crude etchings lies a fleeting form of testimony, one that bypasses law and ritual to speak of everyday realities. These graffiti are not polished or idealized. They are raw, immediate, reflecting the commonness of encounters that official culture preferred to ignore or condemn. Inscriptions too provide indirect evidence. Royal or legal texts sometimes reference prostitutes, usually in the context of laws or decrees. The Code of Hammurabi, for instance, contained provisions regulating tavern women and prostitutes, forbidding them from certain acts and marking their exclusion from respectability. Later inscriptions and administrative tablets list categories of women attached to temples or households, some of whom may have engaged in prostitution. These mentions are sparse and usually incidental, reflecting not the voices of the women themselves but the bureaucratic gaze that sought to regulate or record them. Economic tablets provide perhaps the most consistent traces. Prostitutes, particularly tavern women, were often enmeshed in debt arrangements. Their labor, like that of slaves or laborers, was recorded as a form of economic obligation. Some tablets list tavern keepers, often women themselves who employed prostitutes, lending them barley or silver against their future earnings. These documents reduce lives to accounts, but through them, one glimpses the precariousness of survival. The prostitute was not a free agent, but part of a web of credit and debt, her labor already pledged before it was even performed. Archaeology preserves these details, not because the women wished to leave them behind, but because administrators found it necessary to record them. Artifacts from taverns further enrich this picture. Excavations of drinking houses reveal rooms with benches, jars for beer, and spaces where groups gathered. These taverns were the workplaces of prostitutes, and the objects found within cups, seal impressions, fragments of vessels, speak of the mingling of alcohol, commerce and sexuality. The material culture of taverns preserved in fragments confirms the textual evidence that these were spaces of both social gathering and sexual transaction. The silence of the archaeological record is also telling. No tombs are marked with inscriptions naming a woman as a prostitute, no hymns celebrate their lives, no monumental statues preserve their likenesses. They appear in fragments, in the margins of tablets, and the smallness of figurines always peripheral. This absence reflects not only the precariousness of their lives, but the deliberate erasure of their memory. In a society where honor was tied to household and lineage, those outside that framework left little that posterity deemed worthy of remembrance. Archaeology can recover their traces, but always faintly, through the objects of others, and yet in these traces, there is a quiet testimony to endurance. Each clay tablet recording a debt, each figurine with its exaggerated form, each scratch of graffiti whispers of women whose names are lost but whose existence was undeniable. They remind us that prostitution was not an abstract category, but a lived reality, inscribed in the very fabric of Mesopotamian cities. Though the women themselves are silent, the artifacts that surrounded them carry echoes of their presence. From these fragments emerges a paradox. Prostitutes were at once invisible and ubiquitous, erased from official memory, yet woven into daily life so deeply that their presence is etched into clay and stone. Archaeology cannot reconstruct their biographies, but it can sketch the outlines of their world, showing how the rhythms of debt, desire, and ritual left behind material traces that endure long after the women themselves are gone. These traces, however fragmentary, remind us that prostitution was sustained not only by the women who lived it, but by the men who sought their labor. Every debt recorded, every figurine molded, every graffito scratched was the product of an encounter, a transaction, a moment between prostitute and client. To follow the trail of archaeology is to be led, inevitably, toward the men whose presence sustained the trade, soldiers stationed in garrisons, merchants passing through on caravans, strangers seeking brief solace in unfamiliar cities. The scattered fragments of archaeology give us a glimpse of prostitutes as they lived, but Mesopotamian myths and stories reveal how they were imagined. In literature, unlike in clay ledgers or graffiti, prostitutes were not nameless debtors or tavern women. They appeared as archetypes, figures shaped by the cultural imagination. These stories cast them in roles of surprising significance, showing how sexuality and the figure of the prostitute could be framed as transformative, civilizing, and even sacred. Yet the symbolic roles assigned in myth often contrasted sharply with the harsher realities of the women who lived such lives in the streets and taverns of Mesopotamia. The most famous example comes from the Epic of Gilgamesh, one of the oldest surviving works of literature. In its early chapters, the wild man Enkidu lives apart from civilization, roaming with the animals, drinking from their watering holes, and eating grass like a gazelle. To bring him into the world of humans, Shamhat, a prostitute or courtesan, is sent. She seduces Enkidu, and after 6 days and 7 nights of lovemaking, he finds himself changed. The animals flee from him. He can no longer run with them as before. Instead, Shamhat teaches him to eat bread and drink beer, hallmarks of human culture. Through her, Enkidu becomes part of the city, able to join Gilgamesh on his great adventures. Shamhat's role is extraordinary. In a society that legally and socially marginalized prostitutes, myth placed one at the very center of the civilizing process. She is not portrayed as dishonorable or degraded, but as a conduit of culture. Her sexuality is not incidental but essential. Through it, Enkidu is transformed, losing the wildness of nature and gaining the capacities of civilization. Shamhat becomes the bridge between wilderness and city, between animal and human, between chaos and order. Yet this symbolic role does not erase the contradictions. Shamhat's cultural power in myth does not mean real prostitutes were respected in daily life. Rather, her role reflects how Mesopotamians projected their ambivalence about sexuality and women onto symbolic figures. Shamhat embodies both allure and marginality, both power and dishonor. She is celebrated as civilizing, but in the epic she vanishes after her task is complete, her importance to the story exhausted once Enkidu enters the city. In this way, even in myth, prostitutes are both central and peripheral, agents of transformation, yet discarded once their function is fulfilled. Shamhat is not alone. Other myths and hymns reference women associated with sexuality, taverns or temples. The goddess Inanna, later Ishtar, often associated with love, war, and fertility, presided over domains that overlapped with prostitution. Some texts describe her temples as places where sexual rituals may have been performed, though scholars debate whether this constituted sacred prostitution in the sense once imagined by 19th and early 20th century historians. Regardless, the link between the goddess of love and the figure of the prostitute suggests a cultural association between sexuality and divine power, even if that association was complex and contested. In myths of Inanna's descent to the underworld, or her tumultuous relationships with mortal kings, the themes of desire, power, and danger intertwine. Prostitutes in this symbolic landscape echoed the goddess's domain. They were tied to desire and fertility, but also to the fragility of status and the volatility of human fortune. Their presence in literature reinforced the idea that sexuality was both necessary and perilous, capable of building culture yet also threatening to destabilize it. Other texts such as wisdom literature and proverbs often portray prostitutes in less exalted terms. In some proverbs, the tavern keeper or prostitute is a figure of temptation, leading men astray into debt and dishonor. These sayings reflect the suspicion and disdain attached to prostitution in daily life, where contact with such women was tolerated but frowned upon. The contrast between Shamhat's dignified role in epic and the tavern woman's disparaged role in proverbs highlights the tension between symbolic and lived realities. Even so, Shamhat's story endured precisely because it resonated with deeper cultural anxieties. Enkidu's transformation through sex with a prostitute encapsulated the duality of Mesopotamian attitudes. Sexuality was both polluting and civilizing, both dangerous and essential. The figure of the prostitute embodied this duality more than any other, making her a powerful symbolic tool in literature. It is striking that one of the earliest and most enduring stories in human history places a prostitute at its heart. This suggests that despite the stigma of daily life, the cultural imagination could not ignore the symbolic weight of prostitution. Prostitutes were liminal figures, outside the household, yet inside the city, dishonored, yet necessary. Myth used this liminality to tell stories of transformation, stories that needed figures who could stand between worlds. Shamhat was exactly such a figure, neither fully excluded nor fully honored, but suspended in between, powerful in her marginality. The stories, however, leave us with unanswered questions. Did real prostitutes see themselves reflected in Shamhat? Did tavern women ever think of themselves as agents of culture? Or was this purely a projection of elite male authors and scribes? Archaeology and law remain silent on this, giving us no words from the women themselves. We are left only with the symbolic, which both elevates and erases, making prostitutes central in myth but marginal in reality. In this sense, the myths both illuminate and obscure. They show us how Mesopotamians imagined prostitutes, but they do not tell us how prostitutes lived. They offer symbolism, not biography. Yet they remind us that even those most marginalized in daily life could become essential in the realm of story. Shamhat civilizes Enkidu, but the real Shamhat, the woman who might have poured beer in a tavern or sat outside a city gate, remains unknowable, her life lost beneath layers of clay and silence. Still, by examining these myths alongside the archaeological traces, a fuller picture emerges. Prostitutes were not just marginal workers in taverns or nameless debtors in ledgers. They were also cultural symbols, embodiments of anxieties and aspirations, placed into stories that explored the boundaries of civilization itself. They remind us that in Mesopotamia, as in many societies, myth and reality existed side by side, reflecting each other in ways that were both revealing and contradictory. And just as Shamhat's story turns inevitably toward the men she encounters, so too does the reality of prostitution lead us to consider the clients who sustained the trade. For while prostitutes embodied transformation and survival, their lives and myths alike were shaped by the presence of those who sought them. Soldiers stationed in distant garrisons, merchants traveling long caravan routes, and strangers who passed through city gates, seeking fleeting solace in unfamiliar places. If the myths of Shamhat offered a fleeting image of prostitutes as civilizing agents, the laws of Mesopotamia returned them to their harsher realities. The symbolic elevation of prostitutes in story did not erase the weight of legal and social control in the cities where they lived. In daily life, punishment hung over them like a constant shadow, reinforcing their exclusion and reminding them of the fragile boundaries that set their existence apart from women of households. For all their ubiquity in taverns and alleys, prostitutes lived with the ever-present threat of retribution, a reality inscribed into the very codes of Mesopotamian kings. The most famous of these codes, the Laws of Hammurabi, remains one of the clearest testimonies to how prostitution was managed by authority. While the code included provisions protecting widows, regulating property, and governing inheritance, its treatment of prostitutes leaned heavily toward restriction and punishment. Tavern keepers, many of them women, were explicitly forbidden from harboring conspirators or engaging in fraud. Prostitutes, particularly those attached to taverns, were denied the right to veil themselves in public, a punishment for crossing into the realm of respectable women. If they were caught attempting to disguise themselves under a veil, a privilege reserved for wives, daughters, and concubines, they could be branded or punished with death. This denial of the veil was not trivial. In Mesopotamian society, veiling was more than a fashion. It was a visible declaration of belonging to a household. To cover one's head was to proclaim protection, honor, and respectability. To forbid prostitutes from veiling was to render them perpetually exposed, marked out in public as dishonored. The law's threat of punishment for those who transgressed this rule reveals how fiercely society policed the boundaries between household women and those outside kinship structures. Other punishments were harsher still. Women caught in adultery, or prostitutes who conspired with clients against authority, faced sentences of drowning or burning. These punishments, inscribed in legal codes and echoed in later documents, were both literal threats and symbolic warnings. They reminded women of the dangers of stepping outside their assigned roles, of attempting to blur the lines that separated the respectable from the dishonored. Drowning, burning, the shaving of hair, or the searing of brands, each punishment erased not only life or liberty, but dignity, reducing the body of the woman to a site of control and humiliation. The shaving of hair carried its own symbolic violence. In Mesopotamia, hair was a marker of beauty and identity. To shave a woman's hair was to strip her of individuality and honor, leaving her visibly marked as shamed. Branding was similar, burning into flesh a permanent sign of transgression. These punishments extended dishonor beyond the immediate act, making stigma visible, inescapable, and lasting. For prostitutes already excluded from respectability, such punishments deepened their marginalization, branding them not only as dishonored, but as condemned. Punishment was not only a matter of state law, but of social practice. In a society where households guarded their honor fiercely, retribution for sexual transgressions could fall swiftly. A prostitute caught attempting to seduce a married man risked not only legal penalty, but private vengeance. Her vulnerability outside kinship ties left her with little protection, no father or husband to intervene on her behalf. In this sense, punishment was both formal and informal, exercised by state and community alike, woven into the daily risks of survival. Yet punishment also reveals the contradictions of Mesopotamian society. While prostitutes were marginalized, their existence was tolerated, even necessary. The laws that punished them also regulated them, embedding them into the city's legal order. They could not wear veils, but they could operate taverns. They could not claim household honor, but they could appear in economic records. The threat of punishment, then, was less about eradicating prostitution than about controlling it, ensuring it remained confined to the margins, never blurring into the domain of household respectability. The fear of punishment must have shaped the rhythms of prostitutes' lives. Every step outside, every encounter with a client, carried the risk of transgression. To serve a man of high status risked exposure. To disguise oneself risked death. To step outside the bounds of tolerated behavior risked drowning or branding. These threats were not abstract. They were inscribed into clay, enforced by officials, and remembered by communities. They created an atmosphere in which prostitutes were perpetually visible and perpetually vulnerable, living under the weight of laws that both tolerated and condemned them. The punishments also served as warnings to others. By branding or executing prostitutes who broke boundaries, authorities reinforced the message that household honor was sacrosanct, and that those who lived outside it would remain marked. The harshness of retribution against prostitutes reflected not only their marginality, but the centrality of kinship and household to Mesopotamian order. By punishing the dishonored, society reinforced the privilege of the honored, maintaining the fragile balance that held the city together. And yet within these same laws and practices, one sees the constant entanglement of prostitution with other forms of marginal labor. Prostitutes were punished like slaves who ran away, debtors who defaulted, or tavern keepers who defrauded their patrons. Their punishments reveal the overlap of categories, the way in which prostitution was bound to systems of slavery and debt. A prostitute punished for veiling herself, or for conspiring with clients, might also be a slave, branded not only as dishonored, but as property. In this way, the threat of punishment blurs into the broader realities of bondage. To be punished was not only to suffer retribution, but to be reminded of one's position within the larger hierarchies of Mesopotamian life. Prostitutes, like slaves and debtors, were always at risk, always vulnerable, always subject to the punitive power of law and custom. The harsh punishments recorded in law codes were carved into clay tablets, but their weight was felt most fully in the lived spaces of the city, where fear and necessity walked together after dusk. It was in the dim hours of evening that the lives of prostitutes unfolded most vividly, when the weight of stigma and the threat of punishment mingled with the pressing need to survive. The streets of Mesopotamian cities at night tell a quiet story of vulnerability and endurance, a story glimpsed through the faint traces left in texts and archaeological remains. When the sun descended behind the ziggurats and temples, the city shifted its rhythms. By day, Mesopotamian cities were alive with clamor. Scribes scratching on clay tablets in courtyards, merchants selling grain and oil in crowded markets, temple workers carrying offerings of beer and bread to the gods. But as twilight deepened, a different atmosphere settled in. The wide avenues that connected the temple districts to the palace courtyards emptied of their officials and priests, while the narrow alleys that twisted behind taverns and houses remained alive with movement. Oil lamps flickered faintly at thresholds, casting pools of trembling light into the dust. Shadows lengthened across mud-brick walls, broken only by the faint glow of braziers in taverns, where smoke drifted lazily upward. The watchmen of the city, men of low but official rank, began their slow patrols, carrying staffs and torches, calling out in ritual phrases to signal their presence. Theirs was a duty less about protection and more about control. They were to enforce curfews, deter thieves, and watch for women moving about in ways that did not align with custom. Prostitutes, tavern workers, and enslaved women made up a large part of the nocturnal presence that watchmen observed, tolerated but never respected. In these streets, prostitutes waited for clients. Some leaned against the walls near taverns, their figures half lit by torchlight, their presence both visible and peripheral. Others lingered in the courtyards of inns, or beneath the arches of gates where travelers might pass. Still others moved quietly through alleys, seeking men who had left their households to drink or gamble, catching them in the liminal space between domestic respectability and public transgression. The law codes that forbade prostitutes from veiling ensured they were instantly recognizable, set apart in their visibility. The veil belonged to wives and daughters, to the protected, to those who lived under the authority of households. Prostitutes remained unveiled, their hair unhidden, their bodies rendered into signs of availability. The whisper of the streets at night was not merely literal sound, but the feeling of tension that lingered in the air. There was the murmur of voices from behind tavern walls, the muffled laughter of men deep into their drink, the low bargaining over price, the distant call of watchmen moving between districts. And then there was the silence, broken only by the soft tread of sandaled feet across the packed earth, a silence filled with risk. For every encounter carried the possibility of violence, of arrest, or of betrayal. The punishments inscribed in codes, branding, drowning, burning, hung invisibly over these exchanges, shaping behavior even when no official was present. The taverns, which by day might serve travelers and workers, became at night centers of illicit exchange. Beer, brewed in great jars from barley, was poured into small clay mugs, consumed alongside bread and roasted onions. Smoke from reed torches curled toward the ceilings, staining the mud brick with soot. In these spaces, women worked as both servers and prostitutes, their labor bound up with the rhythms of consumption. They carried beer, exchanged jokes, and then slipped with men into side chambers, where mats or reed partitions offered minimal privacy. The law regarded tavern keepers with suspicion, accusing them of harboring criminals or failing to report conspiracies. By night, the suspicion was thickened by the knowledge that taverns blurred the line between commerce and sexuality, order and disorder. The women themselves lived in the tension between necessity and danger. Many were enslaved, compelled to labor for their owners. Others were debtors, sold or forced into prostitution as a way of surviving obligations inscribed into tablets. Still others worked independently, but precariously, vulnerable to abuse by clients or exploitation by tavern keepers. The night streets were not theirs to control, they navigated them with caution, aware that a single misstep could bring not only violence, but the harsh punishments of the law. The architecture of the city itself shaped their world. Mesopotamian cities were built from mud brick, their walls rising in uneven rows, their alleys narrow and winding. By night, the bricks held the day's heat, radiating it into the air. The smell of dung fires, stale beer, and sweat hung heavy. Doorways opened onto small courtyards where families gathered, their lamps casting faint halos into the street. Prostitutes moved past these thresholds, part of the city yet never fully belonging to its domestic core. Their presence was tolerated so long as it remained in the margins, near taverns, in alleys, at gates, but never welcomed into the respectable glow of household courtyards. The whisper of the streets was also a whisper of stories untold. Archaeological traces hint at graffiti scratched onto walls, sometimes crude, sometimes enigmatic, leaving faint echoes of exchanges that no official record preserved. Clay tablets record fines levied against tavern keepers, debts associated with prostitutes, or punishments handed down in court. But the lived moments, the hesitation in an alley, the soft negotiation over a price, the quiet footsteps as a woman returned home at dawn, these survive only in imagination, pieced together from fragments. For the women themselves, night was both an opportunity and a sentence. It was the time when clients were most available, when coin or grain might be exchanged for their labor, but it was also the time when they were most exposed, without the cover of respectability, without the protection of kinship. Their survival depended on their presence in these spaces, yet their presence marked them for stigma and punishment. In this way, the whisper of the streets at night was the sound of endurance, of women navigating a life circumscribed by necessity, law, and dishonor. And as the night wore on, as lamps guttered low, and the watchmen's voices faded into the distance, the fragile line between freedom and bondage blurred. For many of these women, their labor was not chosen but compelled, not an act of independence but of debt and slavery. The whisper of the streets fades seamlessly into the murmur of the tablet houses, where records of sales and contracts reveal how many prostitutes lived not as free agents, but as property, bound into systems of obligation. The whisper of the streets at night, filled with the muffled sounds of watchmen, tavern laughter, and the quiet negotiations of women working for survival, belonged to a world entirely different from the courtyards of respectability. For as much as prostitution was woven into the fabric of Mesopotamian urban life, it existed always as an undercurrent, shadowed and separate from the brightly lit sanctuaries of wives, priestesses, and noble women. To understand why prostitution carried such weight of dishonor, one must trace the contours of the social gulf that divided the lives of women in the land between rivers. At the heart of Mesopotamian order was the household, the Bedtime, a structure that encompassed not only the physical dwelling but the family, dependents, and even enslaved laborers attached to it. Respectability for women was tied inseparably to this unit. A wife was not merely a companion, but the stabilizing core of household continuity. Her labor in weaving, brewing, child-rearing, and managing provisions ensured that the rhythms of daily life continued smoothly. More importantly, her position was sanctioned by law, temple, and community. Her name might appear on legal contracts concerning dowry or inheritance, and her status was protected by custom. To be a wife was to belong securely to a structure that shielded a woman from dishonor. Priestesses, too, carried a weight of respectability, though of a different kind. Some priestesses were tied to temples, their roles varying by city and deity. The Nadata women of Babylon, for instance, were cloistered in special precincts, dedicating their lives to the service of gods, while managing property and business affairs. These women were often of elite families, and though they lived celibately, they wielded economic influence and social standing. Theirs was a respectability born of ritual purity, sanctioned by the very temples that towered above the city. Noble women, at the apex of society, embodied respectability in its most visible form. They moved within palaces, their garments of fine woolen jewelry marking their elevated status. Their marriages linked dynasties, sealed alliances, and symbolized the stability of political order. Their lives were preserved in inscriptions and commemorated in monuments. While ordinary wives safeguarded the continuity of household life, noble women embodied the continuity of kingship and order itself. Against this backdrop, prostitutes occupied the opposite end of the spectrum. Permanently outside the circle of respectability, they were denied the veil that symbolized protection. They could not pass themselves off as wives or concubines, nor could they hope to ascend into priestly service or noble recognition. Their position was not merely marginal, but codified as dishonorable, a legal and social exclusion written into the daily practices of city life. The burden of respectability lay not only in what wives, priestesses, and noble women possessed, but in what prostitutes were denied. The gulf was not only legal, but spatial. Respectable women occupied domestic courtyards, temple precincts, and palace chambers. Prostitutes were relegated to taverns, alleys, and marketplaces. The architecture of the city itself reflected this division, with thresholds and courtyards serving as barriers that separated the respectable interior from the dishonored exterior. To step across these thresholds was to mark one's social place, and prostitutes were confined to the spaces where respectability refused to reach. Inscriptions and legal records underscore the sharpness of this divide. A wife's testimony could be admitted in legal proceedings. A prostitute's was often excluded. A wife's dowry secured her children's inheritance. A prostitute's offspring were left unprotected, their parentage uncertain. A wife's dishonor reflected upon her husband and family, prompting retribution and restitution. A prostitute's dishonor was simply assumed, needing no further explanation. The burden of respectability, then, was not only a privilege but a weapon of exclusion, ensuring that prostitutes remained forever outside its protections. Yet this exclusion was paradoxical. For all their dishonor, prostitutes were deeply necessary to the functioning of the city. They absorbed men's transgressions, serving as outlets for desires that could not be expressed within the household. They provided services in taverns, kept the flow of beer and company alive, and in doing so, sustained parts of the urban economy. And yet, because their existence was indispensable, their dishonor had to be constantly reinforced, lest the boundaries between household respectability and marginal survival blur. The more necessary they were, the more firmly they were marked as excluded. Respectable women themselves lived under the weight of strict expectations. A wife caught in adultery could be drowned. A priestess who broke her vows might be stripped of her standing. Respectability was thus not freedom but burden, a fragile honor that could be shattered by transgression. But unlike prostitutes, wives, priestesses and noble women could at least aspire to recovery of status through family, dowry, or temple authority. Prostitutes had no such recourse. Once outside respectability, there was no path of return. Their dishonor was permanent, inherited by circumstance or sealed by survival. The burden of respectability also explains the intensity of stigma placed upon prostitutes. By defining them as dishonored, society reaffirmed the privileges of the respected. Every unveiled prostitute in the street reminded wives of the protection their veil afforded. Every tavern worker reminded priestesses of the sanctity of their cloister. Every alleyway encounter underscored the noble woman's separation from the dangers of the public street. Prostitutes carried dishonor not only for themselves but as a foil against which the respectability of others was measured and reinforced. The contrast extended into cultural memory. Myths preserved noble and priestly women in elevated roles, goddesses, queens, intermediaries with the divine, while prostitutes appeared as liminal figures, sometimes symbolically powerful, as in the story of Shamhat, but never honored in the same way. Even when myth elevated the prostitute to a civilizing force, daily life pulled her back into dishonor, ensuring that the gulf between symbolic elevation and social exclusion was never crossed. This social gulf was not static, but actively maintained. Legal codes, veiling practices, punishments, and spatial divisions all reinforced the boundary between respectability and dishonor. The burden of respectability rested not only on those who bore it, but on those who were denied it. For prostitutes carried the stigma that made honor visible and desirable. Without their dishonor, the veil of wives would lose its meaning. Without their exclusion, the cloister of priestesses would lose its sanctity. Without their marginality, the nobility of queens would lose its contrast. In this way, prostitutes carried a paradoxical role, dishonored yet indispensable, excluded yet central, invisible in official honor, yet perpetually visible in public space. Theirs was a burden not of respectability, but of its denial, a weight felt not only in their own lives, but in the lives of every woman whose status was measured against them. And it was in the lives of their children that this exclusion took its deepest toll, for the gulf of respectability did not end with one generation. It passed into the uncertain futures of those born in taverns, alleys, and unrecorded unions, who carried into their own lives the stigma of dishonor. The burden of respectability weighed heavily not only on women themselves, but on those who came after them. Yet the gulf it created remained remarkably stable across the long centuries of Mesopotamian history. From the first cities of Sumer to the dynasties of Babylon and the warlike kings of Assyria, the structures of honor, dishonor and survival shifted less than one might imagine. In the slow passage of generations, what changed most often were the names of rulers and the rise and fall of empires, while the lives of ordinary women, wives sheltered within households, priestesses enclosed in temple precincts, prostitutes lingering in taverns and alleys, remained defined by boundaries as enduring as the baked clay on which their laws were written. The earliest cities of Sumer, with their low mud brick houses and monumental ziggurats, already established the patterns that would persist for centuries. The division between the honored wife and the dishonored prostitute was present in the earliest texts, embedded in language and law. When cuneiform writing developed, its lists of professions already contained the harimchu, the prostitute, alongside the brewer, the weaver, and the scribe. To name them was to normalize their presence, yet also to fix their role, ensuring that long after their lives were forgotten, their occupation remained inscribed on clay. As centuries passed and Akkad rose to prominence under Sargon, followed by the flourishing of Babylon, the codification of law under Hammurabi, and the later dominance of Assyria, these roles persisted. The cities changed their rulers, the gods received different emphases, palaces were rebuilt, and empires expanded and contracted, yet in the streets the patterns of daily survival were little altered. Prostitutes remained part of the tavern, part of the nighttime economy, part of the tolerated but dishonored landscape of the city. The persistence is striking when one considers how much else changed. Empires fell, languages shifted, armies marched, and trade networks stretched outward toward Anatolia, the Levant, and beyond. Yet the prostitute of Sumer and the prostitute of late Babylonian times faced much the same realities: exclusion from respectability, vulnerability to violence, entanglement with slavery and debt, and constant negotiation between survival and punishment. The slow passage of generations did not ease these conditions, but rather enshrined them as part of the enduring order of Mesopotamian life. It is in this slow continuity that one sees most clearly the anonymity of those who lived it. Kings inscribed their victories on monuments, merchants recorded their transactions in detailed ledgers, priests left hymns and prayers, and even ordinary householders occasionally preserved their family arrangements in contracts, but prostitutes rarely left behind names. Their presence is glimpsed in generic terms: Haranchu, Kodashtu, tavern woman, never in the individuality of identity. Their children, often unacknowledged, slipped into the same anonymity, their futures shaped more by survival than by recorded memory. This anonymity was part of the burden they carried. For respectable women, names could be preserved in dowry records, in temple service lists, in inscriptions commissioned by husbands or sons. For prostitutes, memory was fleeting, their identities swallowed into roles, their lives forgotten once their labor ended. Across centuries, their names dissolved into silence, leaving only the persistent echo of the profession itself. The survival of the role, not the individual, is what endured. One might imagine how this persistence looked in the rhythms of everyday life. In Uruk, around 2000 BCE, a woman might wait outside a tavern, trading her labor for grain. Centuries later, in Nineveh, under the Assyrians, another woman might linger in a similar alley, her life bound by the same exclusions, her survival dependent on the same exchanges. Neither woman knew the other, and yet their lives were linked by the continuity of a role that outlasted dynasties. They were connected not by kinship or memory, but by the unbroken thread of marginality, a thread woven into the fabric of Mesopotamian cities for millennia. The endurance of prostitution across generations also reveals the limitations of reform. Laws were rewritten, kings proclaimed justice, temples issued decrees, yet the lives of prostitutes changed little. Each new proclamation might adjust fines or specify punishments, but the basic conditions remained the same. The dishonor was permanent, the vulnerability persistent, the stigma unrelenting. This immovability suggests that prostitution was not an aberration to be eliminated, but an institution to be managed, tolerated, and contained across time. Archaeology reinforces this sense of continuity. Figurines of nude women, sometimes interpreted as fertility symbols, sometimes as reflections of sexual labor, appear across Mesopotamian centuries. Administrative tablets, whether from Sumer, Babylon, or Assyria, record debts tied to women, contracts involving taverns, or punishments for transgression. The material record shows little evidence of change in how prostitutes were perceived or regulated. Instead, it reflects the slow repetition of the same conditions, the same patterns of exclusion, etched into clay and preserved by accident rather than intention. The slow passage of generations also dulled the possibility of resistance. Prostitutes did not leave behind rebellions, manifestos, or reform movements. Their anonymity and marginality made such acts unthinkable. Their endurance was measured not in defiance but in survival, in the simple continuation of life within the boundaries set for them. This endurance, though quiet, was not without significance. It ensured the persistence of the role, carrying it forward from one age to another, a silent inheritance passed not through kinship but through necessity. And so, while kings fell and cities burned, while dynasties shifted, and gods changed their hierarchies, the prostitute's role remained. Theirs was not the dramatic story of conquest or collapse, but the steady, unchanging story of survival in the margins. In this continuity lies a different kind of history, not one of names and events, but of roles and structures, of lives remembered only as functions within a system that endured for millennia. When we look back now, it is this continuity that is most striking. The prostitute of Sumer could have walked the streets of Assyria without feeling entirely displaced, her dishonor and vulnerability instantly recognizable. The centuries between them mattered little in the face of the persistence of stigma. This is the slow passage of generations, a history where the individuals dissolve but the role survives, where names are lost but categories remain, where memory fades yet structures endure. And as this role persisted in Mesopotamia, it also echoed outward into neighboring cultures, where similar dynamics of respectability, dishonor, and survival took shape, adapted to local customs, but carrying the same weight of stigma and necessity. As empires rose and fell, prostitutes remained a constant presence, bound to the cycles of urban life, just as the bricks of the ziggurats and the channels of the canals tied the cities to their land. Yet even as the centuries stretched forward, the world of Mesopotamia began to waver. The great capitals that once seemed immortal, Uruk, Babylon, Nineveh, slowly entered periods of decline, whether through the exhaustion of resources, the shifting of rivers, invasions by outside peoples, or the relentless passage of time. With each decline, ordinary lives became more precarious, and for those already at the margins, tavern women, slaves, prostitutes, the uncertainty of the city's fate meant that the fragile threads of survival grew ever thinner. The decline of Mesopotamian cities was never a single collapse, but a rhythm of contraction and renewal, of decay followed by rebuilding, of abandonment followed by resettlement. Urban life was cyclical, yet over time the cycles grew harsher, the intervals of stability shorter. For prostitutes, this meant that their work, which had once existed in the bustling, crowded heart of thriving cities, often had to shift into spaces marked by scarcity, unrest, and insecurity. When palaces were rich and temples well-funded, their lives were harsh but predictable. When palaces emptied and temples crumbled, predictability gave way to desperation. The end of Sumer offers an early glimpse of this rhythm. As Sumerian city-states fell to Akkadian power, many temples and households were disrupted. The networks that had sustained prostitution, taverns supplied with grain, brothels tucked into dense neighborhoods, the steady flow of merchants and soldiers were shaken. In periods of instability, women who had depended on a regular flow of clients faced sharper uncertainty, turning survival into an even more urgent calculation. Still, the role itself did not vanish. Even in decline, there were always those who would pay for intimacy, and always those who, lacking protection, would trade it. Later, as Akkad crumbled and Babylon rose, the same patterns repeated. Hammurabi's Babylonian reforms brought order, but order itself was fragile. After his dynasty, waves of conquest, famine, and shifting alliances destabilized the urban core. In these times, prostitution adapted not by disappearing, but by finding its place within disorder. Soldiers of new rulers sought release. Merchants traveling amid uncertainty still stopped at taverns. Women without family ties remained vulnerable, their bodies becoming both shield and currency against the hardships of urban decline. The Assyrian cities perhaps best illustrate how decline weighed on the margins. Nineveh and Ashur were once centers of formidable power. Their armies feared across the Near East. Within their walls, prostitution flourished much as it had for centuries, woven into the tavern economy and the dimly lit streets. But when Assyria fell suddenly in the late 7th century BCE, burned and sacked by Medes and Babylonians, the social fabric tore violently. The collapse was not gradual but catastrophic, and with it, countless lives were extinguished or displaced. Prostitutes, whose survival depended on the stability of city life, would have been among the most immediately imperiled. Without taverns, without the shelter of urban crowds, without the fragile protection of commerce, their role dissolved into silence alongside the city itself. Babylon, however, tells a different story of decline. Its cycles were slower, its collapses stretched over centuries. The city endured sackings, rebuildings, and foreign occupations. Through these long stretches, prostitution remained a fixture, adapting to new rulers whether they were Chaldeans, Persians, or later Seleucids. Yet the endurance was hollow, marked by a gradual erosion of the city's cultural dominance. Where once prostitutes had been part of a dynamic urban system tied to the grandeur of temples and the flow of international trade, in later centuries they were bound to a city that was a shadow of its former self. The work remained, but the scale and significance diminished, mirroring the fading glow of Babylon's name. Decline also meant that records grew scarcer. Early periods, flush with scribes and orderly archives, preserved contracts and decrees mentioning prostitutes. Later eras, especially in the centuries when Mesopotamia fell under foreign empires, left fewer local voices. The prostitutes of these times fade almost entirely into silence. Their presence was still there, implied by continuity, but the traces became faint, as though the very act of decline erased not only monuments, but also the memory of marginal lives. It is telling that myths endured even when cities declined. The story of Shamhat civilizing Enkidu, the archetype of the prostitute as liminal figure between wildness and society, outlasted the very cities where it was first told. Yet in reality, the prostitutes who lived through the decline of Mesopotamian cities were not immortalized but forgotten. Their survival was not a tale to be recited, but a labor to be endured day after day, until the city around them could no longer sustain them. As decline deepened, displacement became a constant theme. Women uprooted by war, famine, or the collapse of households often found themselves forced into prostitution as the last option. This pattern repeated across centuries, binding the fall of cities directly to the persistence of sex work. Urban decline did not erase prostitution, rather it scattered it, made it more precarious, more vulnerable, more desperate. It ensured that the women involved were tied not only to the prosperity of cities, but also to their fragility. The slow death of Mesopotamian cities, then, was lived most acutely not by kings or priests, whose names still appear in chronicles, but by those at the margins. Prostitutes felt decline in their stomachs, in the scarcity of grain, in the fear of soldiers patrolling ruined streets, in the collapse of taverns that once offered a measure of stability. Their role, though enduring, was inseparable from the life of the city, and as the cities waned, so too did their fragile livelihoods. What remains now is not their names or stories, but the recognition of their persistence across the very cycle of rise and fall. They were there in Sumer's dawn, in Babylon's prime, in Assyria's might, and they were still there as each of these cities declined. Prostitutes were as much a part of the rhythm of Mesopotamian urban life as the canals and the marketplaces. But unlike canals, their labor left almost no lasting trace. Their constancy was lived, not remembered, and their endurance was bound to the fate of cities that eventually faded into dust. And as Mesopotamian civilization itself waned, swallowed by new powers and new cultures, the role of the prostitute did not disappear, but migrated, carried forward into the customs and laws of neighboring societies, adapting again to new languages, new gods, and new urban centers. And as Mesopotamian civilization itself waned, swallowed by new powers and new cultures, the role of the prostitute did not disappear, but migrated, carried forward into the customs and laws of neighboring societies, adapting again to new languages, new gods, and new urban centers. What had been established in the land between the rivers, the recognition of prostitution as a tolerated yet stigmatized occupation, did not vanish with the fall of Babylon or the sack of Nineveh. Instead, it echoed outward, finding new expression in the traditions of Greece, Rome, and the writings that would later shape biblical thought. These echoes were not mere repetitions but transformations, shaped by the values and anxieties of each new culture. Yet the core elements that had defined prostitution in Mesopotamia, the tension between tolerance and dishonor, the association with taverns and marginal spaces, the legal codification of both protection and punishment, remained remarkably consistent. In this sense, Mesopotamia did not simply invent urban life, it also laid down patterns of social marginalization that would be inherited by civilizations long after its cities crumbled. In Greek society, the presence of prostitution was both normalized and layered with class distinctions, much as it had been in Sumer and Babylon. The Greeks spoke openly of hetarai, courtesans, who, like the higher status women of Mesopotamia, could move in educated circles, sometimes even influencing politics through their associations with powerful men. Yet at the same time, the Greeks also had pornai, women of the streets, directly echoing the divisions seen in Mesopotamia between courtesans and tavern workers. This bifurcation suggests a continuity in how societies grappled with the role, recognizing that it fulfilled certain social functions while insisting on a hierarchy that confined most women to stigma. The Romans inherited much of this outlook, codifying prostitution into law while branding it with dishonor. All Roman prostitutes were registered, taxed, and legally distinct from respectable women, echoing Mesopotamian codes that had drawn sharp lines between wives, priestesses, and prostitutes. Like their Mesopotamian counterparts, Roman prostitutes could not marry men of higher status, and their testimony was often discounted in legal contexts. The rhythms of taverns, brothels, and urban streets where sex was exchanged for survival carried forward with little alteration, proving that the framework first laid in Mesopotamia had remarkable resilience. Perhaps most striking, however, is the way biblical texts carry forward Mesopotamian attitudes. The Hebrew Bible, emerging in the very lands once dominated by Mesopotamian empires, is saturated with references to prostitutes, often as metaphors for waywardness or sin. Cities like Babylon itself were depicted as harlots in prophetic literature, symbols of excess and corruption. This linguistic inheritance shows how the imagery of prostitution, forged in the urban imagination of Mesopotamia, became a powerful cultural shorthand that endured for millennia. Yet the echoes were not only negative. The story of Rahab in the Book of Joshua portrays a prostitute who aids Israelite spies, and in doing so secures survival for her family. This tension between stigma and survival reflects precisely the dual nature of prostitution in Mesopotamia, dishonored in public life, yet essential in certain moments of necessity. The persistence of this duality shows how deeply the Mesopotamian experience shaped later narratives, embedding the contradictions of prostitution into the moral frameworks of successive civilizations. Continuity across cultures also highlights the enduring association between prostitution and the urban environment. In Mesopotamia, prostitution thrived in cities, tied to taverns, marketplaces, and crowded streets. In Greece, Athens was the hub. In Rome, it was the Subura district. In biblical writings, cities are often places of temptation and vice, in contrast to the imagined purity of pastoral life. The suspicion of urban centers as morally corrupt has its roots in the very birth of cities along the Tigris and Euphrates, where prostitution first became a recognizable profession. Another echo lies in the symbolic use of prostitutes in myth and literature. In Mesopotamian epics, Shamhat represents civilization, bringing Enkidu from wildness into human society. In Greek texts, courtesans appear as figures of wit and influence. In Roman satire, prostitutes serve as foils to expose hypocrisy. In biblical prophecy, prostitutes become metaphors for nations straying from divine law. Across these varied traditions, the prostitute occupies a liminal role, both inside and outside society, both necessary and condemned, just as she had in the earliest cities of Sumer. These echoes remind us that stigma is rarely an invention of a single culture. Rather, it is inherited, reinforced, and reshaped across time. The dishonor that clung to Mesopotamian prostitutes, denied respectable marriage, excluded from civic life, marked by law, did not vanish, but was transmitted, a kind of cultural residue passed from one civilization to the next. Even when the names of cities changed and new gods were worshipped, the framework of marginalization remained, as enduring as the clay tablets buried in the ruins of Mesopotamia. What is perhaps most haunting is that the echoes persist even today. The laws and cultural attitudes of later civilizations, themselves shaped by Mesopotamian precedents, continue to influence modern debates about sex work, the tension between tolerance and stigma, regulation and exclusion, survival and dishonor. These are not new struggles but ancient ones, stretching back to the very birth of cities. In this way, Mesopotamia's prostitutes, though their individual lives have been forgotten, still speak through history. They echo in Greek courtesans, in Roman brothels, in biblical metaphors, and in the lingering ambivalence of modern societies. Their presence was not confined to their own time, it became part of the very cultural fabric of the West, woven into law, literature, and morality. And so the story of Mesopotamian prostitution, does not end with the fall of Babylon or the fading of cuneiform. It continues in the echoes carried forward, subtle but persistent, shaping perceptions of women, sexuality, and urban life across centuries. But to close this long and shadowed history, it is necessary to step beyond the echoes and return, in thought, to the women themselves, forgotten individuals who lived, suffered, and endured. For their lives, more than the laws or myths, reveal the true human weight of what it meant to exist at the margins of the world's first cities. But to close this long and shadowed history, it is necessary to step beyond the echoes and return, in thought, to the women themselves, forgotten individuals who lived, suffered, and endured. For their lives, more than the laws or myths, reveal the true human weight of what it meant to exist at the margins of the world's first cities. And yet, their voices are gone. No words of theirs remain. What we know of them comes only from the fragments left behind. Clay tablets, etched by scribes who judged them, laws that regulated or condemned them, myths that turned them into symbols, and ruins that swallowed the spaces in which they once lived and worked. This silence is perhaps the most striking legacy of Mesopotamian prostitution, in an age where kings carved their victories onto stone, where priests recorded hymns to gods, and merchants etched contracts into clay. The women who stood in the doorways of taverns, or lingered in the shadowed alleys, left behind no trace of their own voices. Their experiences, their thoughts, their griefs, and their small hopes are lost. What survives are only the shapes cast by others, the legislator's decree, the priest's condemnation, the poet's invention. They exist in history as shadows, not as presences. The silence is not empty though. It forces us to imagine the ordinary lives that slipped through the cracks of the historical record. When we read of tavern women forbidden to pour out too much beer, or of prostitutes forbidden from marrying respectable men, we are reminded that these laws were written because real women were living those realities. Behind each tablet and decree there were lives shaped by necessity and survival. The silence presses us to remember them not as abstractions but as human beings, even if their names are long dissolved into dust. The ruins of Mesopotamia tell part of this story. Excavated taverns, narrow lanes worn by centuries of footsteps, broken figurines that may have once represented women of pleasure. All of these fragments speak indirectly. They hint at lives lived in the margins of urban space. A carved boundary stone may record the prohibition of a prostitute's testimony, but it also testifies to her presence in the courts, to her attempt to participate in civic life. A tablet recording a debt tied to tavern beer also points to the economic struggle of the women who worked there, who balanced their survival against the weight of creditors. Even in silence, they left impressions, like footsteps pressed into mud that hardened into clay. Myth preserved their image in another form. Shamhat, in the Epic of Gilgamesh, remains one of the most enduring representations of a prostitute in ancient literature. Yet she too is silent. Her words are the poet's, not her own. She is remembered not as an individual but as a role, the civilizer, the liminal figure, the threshold between wilderness and city. Real prostitutes in Mesopotamia might have found no recognition in this literary shadow. Their harsh lives bore little resemblance to Shamhat's symbolic purpose, yet her story endured while theirs disappeared. It is a reminder of how myth preserves symbols, but erases the lived reality behind them. The silence also underscores the weight of stigma. To be written about only in laws and myths is to be denied a voice in one's own history. Prostitutes in Mesopotamia were deemed unworthy of civic remembrance. Their dishonor was codified into law, their marginality woven into the very fabric of urban life. Respectable women might be remembered as priestesses or wives of kings. Prostitutes were remembered only as problems to be managed or metaphors to be invoked. Silence became part of the punishment, extending even beyond life into the realm of memory. And yet, their persistence is undeniable. Across centuries from Sumer to Babylon to Assyria, they remained. While dynasties fell and empires shifted, while temples rose and crumbled, the women at the edge of taverns and in the shadowed alleys continued to exist, their lives repeating across generations. Their silence in the record does not mean they were absent, it means only that they were unacknowledged. The endurance of their role, across 2,000 years of Mesopotamian history, is itself a form of testimony, even if it is voiceless. What lingers most is a sense of loss, the recognition that thousands upon thousands of individual lives have vanished almost entirely from memory. Each woman bore her own burdens, perhaps a widow forced into sex work by debt, a slave compelled by her owner, a daughter without kinship ties, or a tavern worker trading beer for survival. Each life contained moments of sorrow, endurance, and perhaps even brief joys, yet all are gone. Their voices did not reach the tablets, and their stories did not become epics. They have dissolved into the silence of the past. This silence, however, also invites reflection. It reminds us that history is not only about kings, priests, and battles, but about the countless unnamed individuals who sustained the life of cities in unseen ways. The prostitutes of Mesopotamia were part of that unseen foundation. Their absence from the record is a stark reminder of how selective history can be, and how much of human experience lies hidden in silence. To walk today among the ruins of Uz or Babylon is to feel that silence deeply. The ziggurats rise, the temple platforms remain, the baked bricks still bear inscriptions of rulers long gone. Yet the streets, where prostitutes once waited for clients, are empty. The doorways of taverns stand open but hollow. The women who once lived there have left no voices behind. Only silence remains, carried on the desert wind across the eroded walls. In that silence one can almost sense the weight of forgotten lives, the harsh reality of existing in the margins of the first cities. The silence is not peace but absence, the absence of memory where human presence once endured. It is the final chapter of a story that began in the dawn of cities and continued through centuries of survival, stigma, and endurance. And so the story ends quietly, not with resolution but with reflection. The prostitutes of Mesopotamia are gone, their names unrecorded, their thoughts unknowable. What remains are laws written against them, myths that used them, and ruins that swallowed them, a quiet end to a harsh life.